Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Greetings from California. It is bright and early here, and I'm up and at 'em, and I have my coffee, and I'm excited to be with you. As Jillian said, we've been planning this for a long time, so it's great that it's finally here. Um, Sorry that it's under these circumstances. I know this has been a difficult year plus for everyone, so I hope that you are healthy and your loved ones are healthy where you are. This will be very interactive. I know you're probably thinking, oh, wow, 4 hours online. That's going to be, I'm just going to turn off my camera and just listen to what's interesting. And maybe you're going to do that. That's fine. But it's actually, I think it's going to go pretty fast. Design thinking is a very hands-on way of working. I've been teaching here at Stanford for almost a decade now and come to this work as a practitioner. I was a design director and creative director at the Washington Post and was a journalist for a long time and was really involved at the Post in the transition from the newspaper business to 24/7 digital media operation. And so my specialty in design thinking is not just in how you design products and services for people, but it's really about organizational change, which is why I think that we'll be a good fit for each other. How do you create new ways of working within an organization in order to get to new outcomes? How do you help people hold risk in order to try something different, in order to create something that's going to be different than what you've done in the past? And really focusing on how do you design for behavior, right? How do you make it okay for people to try something different? And so that is my particular area of specialty. I teach organization design at Stanford, graduate courses to business students and engineering students and medical students and all kinds of different domains. So I'm always hoping to give you something new to think about, but also bridge the gap between learning and doing, being able to apply it. So if we go through these sessions and we just have a good time together and we learn something new and it was interesting, but you go back and you say, wow, that was fun. Now back to work, then we're not really maximizing it. And so I think the best way to bridge that gap is to be able to have a conversation, for you to ask questions, for us to be able to talk to each other about, well, what about in this situation, or what about in that situation? So even though, my wife sometimes says that I like the sound of my own voice, I would love for you to interrupt me and for us to be able to have that kind of discussion. Okay, that sound good? All right, excellent. Thank you for your thumbs up. Good, appreciate it. We are going to start with a little activity this morning in just a few minutes that's going to need for you to turn on your cameras, but you don't have to do it just yet. It is 5:06 a.m. here, so I have my camera on, so you can't possibly look as rough as I do. But anyway, just to let you know, in just a couple minutes, we will do an activity with our cameras on. But let me jump in first with design thinking and do a little level setting for us. Some of you, no doubt, have been exposed to design thinking before. It's something that has really taken off around the world, and especially in consulting, it's kind of been commoditized and scaled in a way. So hopefully we'll debunk some of those myths about it being just a prescription for innovation, and more of a way of working that grows as you use it. But I like to start off with this definition. So with design thinking, we're very much focused on the problem that we're trying to solve. So rather than jumping straight from problem to solution, right, which tends to be our impulse in a way, especially if you have expertise in a particular area, or you have experience, you've been working in an area for a long time, we might say, hey, our next project, let's do this thing, right? And you start to say, oh, what's a creative way for us to do this thing, right? And we're going straight to ideas about the solutions to the challenges that we're working on. With design thinking, we spend a lot of time thinking about the challenge first. We definitely have a reason why we're taking something on, but now we're saying, is this problem really rooted in a deep need of another person or a group of people? And how are we framing this problem that we're trying to solve? Are we framing it around a potential incremental improvement on what already exists? Or are we really going to try to push for something that we don't currently do, or something that's never been done? And then we get to the, how do we solve this problem creatively? So it's a lot of, being comfortable with the uncomfortability of not having the right answer, recognizing that there are very few things where the right answer will be the right answer for very long. The world is evolving and changing, and how do we build into that adaptability? The second part of this is this tiny little Venn diagram here that I really like. If you think of corporate innovation or innovation in an organizational context as the overlap between what is desirable for the people that you're creating something for, what is viable for your organization or viable as a business, and then what is feasible, how do you allocate your resources to be able to do this thing? What design thinking is really useful for is the desirability piece. Okay, it's not the entire picture, but because it's really predicated on connecting with people in their context to understand their behavior from their perspective, right? Then it helps us create things that are meaningful for the people that we're trying to serve. But equally important in any organizational context is this feasible for us to now do, right? In many cases, it's what do we have to stop doing in order to be able to execute on this idea that is desirable. And then of course it's viability. Is this a business? Is it sustainable, right? Is this something that we can, that will support itself? Yeah. So this brings me to sort of my first question for you, and I'm going to use a polling function here. Okay. First question. Do you think of yourself as creative? Do you think of yourself as creative? I'm not going to give you any wiggle room here. It's just a binary question. No, I'm not a creative person. Yes, I am a creative person. You don't have to answer what you think I want to hear. I think we set these up anonymously, so we're not going to come back to you later and ask you about it. Okay, we're almost done. Do you think of yourself as creative? A couple more seconds. Thank you for your answer. Okay. So here's how you responded. So we're about 70-30. About 7 out of 10 of you think of yourselves as creative. 3 out of 10 of you think that you're not so creative. All right, this is going to take us into our first activity. Now listen, I promise that we're not going to do anything silly that doesn't have a reason behind it. It doesn't mean that we're not going to do some things that are uncomfortable, because part of the path to creating something that's never been done is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Okay, so this first activity, this was founded by a sort of predecessor for me at Stanford, a gentleman named Bob McKim, who was the founder of the product design program at Stanford back in the 1960s and a legendary product designer here in the US. Okay, and so here's what we're going to do. In just a minute, you are going to be put into a breakout room with a random stranger. Okay, you are the random stranger and they are probably a stranger to you. All you need for this is something to write on and something to write with. Okay, so I have my Post-it notes here. There we go. It doesn't have to be a big piece of paper. Could be something small. And we're just going to put you in this breakout room for 2 minutes. Now you're going to need to turn your camera on, okay, in order to do this, because here's what you're going to do. In the first minute, I would like for you to draw a portrait of the other person. You're going to sketch a picture of their face, and they're going to sketch a picture of your face. Okay, you're both doing it at the same time. You're going to have 1 minute. Then I'm going to send a note out to you and say, okay, pens down. The second minute, I want you to share your drawing with the person that you drew. You're only going to be there for 1 minute to do that, so don't worry too much. And then we will pull you back into the main room and talk about why we did that. Okay? This is not a litmus test, okay? But if the numbers drop off, we will learn a little bit about the participants. Just kidding. Okay, here we go. We're going to put you in the breakout rooms. Katie, you going to set us up for that? Thank you. We'll see you back here in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I see lots of smiles. That's always a good sign after that activity. I love it. Okay, so what is the reason why we did this? Well, first of all, let's just have a very short conversation. You can unmute if you want. Okay, so how did that activity feel? How did that feel for you, anyone? Or you can use the chat.
Embarrassing. It's one of the most stressful experiences of my life.
No,
Okay.
I thought that was fun. Like, the first fun thing I did today, probably.
Okay, good. It was fun and it was the most stressful experience of your life. Someone said embarrassing. I'm sure that Yes.
We were doing it at the same time, so it actually felt comfortable that we were both in the same position together, actually having a bit of a laugh, excusing each other in advance.
Yes. Wonderful. Thanks for that, Ali. Yeah. I mean, anytime we take a risk together, it lowers the barrier to risk individually, right? Because it's not, it's not just one of us stepping out. Okay, good. Wonderful. Anyone else? How did that feel?
It was just nice to do something different because we all sit in front of a screen. We barely write anymore. So it actually was just nice to pick up a pen and use it in a different capacity. So I guess it makes you think in a different way, right?
Yeah, good. Thank you, Jessica.
I found it quite liberating, is doing it with a complete stranger. There was no prejudice, no previous knowledge.
Yes.
So it was really interesting, really look and observe and try to glean something more than just shapes.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you, Kate. How many of you if you had anxiety about that activity, did the time constraint add to your anxiety? Anybody have that? Yeah, you could just show your hands if you want. Okay. What about, how about the other side of it? You said, hey, we're only doing this for 1 minute, so they can't expect too much, right? Okay, so sometimes we'd call that a creative constraint. And we use time as creative constraints all the time in design thinking, right? I didn't give you a whole lot of time to think about it. Some of you probably felt, even if it was embarrassing, that you had to participate because you're a little bit beholden to your stranger partner, right? And if you're like, I'm just not going to do this, then it's not, might be some worry there about how they feel about you. Okay, so here's why I love that activity, right? So Bob started that. He used to do that on the first day of class with his students each term back in the 1960s. And the reason why he would do that is because this term creative, how many of you think of yourselves as creative? It is a bit of a loaded term, right? And in fact, in any room full of adults, if you ask a room full of adults, how many of you think of yourselves as creative? Typically only half the room will raise their hands. Okay, we had almost 70% here, so you were higher than the average. If you ask a room full of 5-year-olds, how many of you think of yourselves as creative? How many you think raise their hands? Right? All of them, they raise both hands, right? If they even stop to listen to you because they're probably doing something creative. Okay, so what happens for half of us that from the time we're 5 to the time we become adults, we stop thinking of ourselves as creative? Often it goes back to maybe a time you were 8 or 9 or 10 years old and you realize that you couldn't draw, right? Often it's some art project, usually something we do in school, right? So maybe your drawing didn't turn out as well as the child sitting next to you, or in my case, I grew up in the southeastern part of the United States. And when we were 8 years old, we all made clay ashtrays for our parents. I don't know if you did that. It was a different time. They may still do that in North Carolina. I don't know, maybe. Right. So whatever it was, maybe your ashtray or your vase or your bowl or your drawing maybe didn't turn out as well as the child sitting next to you. And maybe you thought, you know what, I'm good at math, right? I'm good at math and I get good marks in math and I like getting good marks in math. And so I want to do more math, right? Or, I'm really good at creative writing and my teacher really likes my writing. And so I'm going to join the writing club after school, right? I mean, it turns out most of us like to do things that we're good at, right? And we start to learn what we're good at when we're 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And in many cases, then we start to lean into that thing. And we say, oh, I'm good at math. And so I'm going to become an engineer. I get to go to university and I'm going to study engineering and I'll become an engineer. Or I'm good at writing and I'm going to try to be a writer or whatever it may be, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with expertise. We all need to be good at the things that we're responsible for, right? But we don't want to think of creativity as only the domain of artists. Okay, so at the D School, what we're really interested in is not how great you can draw. What we're interested in is how willing are you to try something that's a little bit uncomfortable? How willing are you to show unfinished work to someone else, right? Here's a work in progress. What do you think of this? How willing are you essentially to take a little bit of a personal risk, right? I talked earlier about getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Now, why do you think that behavior is important and something that we want to grow? Well, if you talk about innovation, so we teach innovation at the D School, right? Really broad, jargony term these days, right? But if we think about innovation, not in the sense of the incremental, what do we mean by innovation? And innovation is something that, what? Anybody? And innovation is something that, any thoughts?
Something that's new and
Something that's new.
revolutionary.
Something new and revolutionary. Perfect, Dev. Thank you. Yeah, if we think of an innovation as something new and revolutionary, something that's never been done, if we want to create something new and unusual, perfect, Will. If we want to create something that's never been done, then we have to do something different, right? We can't do the same things that we've always done and expect a different outcome. That's actually the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting something different to happen. Okay, so often the first step into this innovation space is trying something we haven't done before. Okay, and that can be the biggest barrier because many of us, we sort of build up our own self-image around being good at the thing that we're good at, right? We're often not incentivized really to try something different. It's often in our successes that have gotten us to, you know, the point in our careers where we are. Even if our organizations are saying, you know, fail fast and learn as you go, sometimes the incentive structures aren't there for that, right? I don't know in your annual reviews if there's a how many failures did you have this year? Way to go, extra bonus for you, right? So it's difficult to try something different. Here's the other thing. Anytime we try something that we've never done before, we will inevitably make mistakes, right? The only way to avoid mistakes is to do the same thing over and over again, to really focus on efficiency. Okay, so all of those things, making mistakes and, you know, not wanting that risk to reflect poorly on you or whatever it might be, those things are all barriers for us. And yet we know rationally that to create something that's never been done, we have to do something different. So we call this kind of creativity, we call it creative confidence. And David Kelly, who's the founder of the D School and the founder of IDEO, if any of you are familiar with IDEO, a lot of Stanford professors have very lucrative side businesses. David's is IDEO. And David is a famous product designer in the US, designed the first mouse for Apple back in the day, designed the Palm Pilot. If any of you are my age or older, do you remember the Palm Pilot? That was basically the first successful consumer tablet, sort of ahead of its time. Out of business now, like a lot of first movers, but that's a different story. So, you know, David talks about creative confidence. He has a book called Creative Confidence. What we're really talking about, our research term, Jillian, is creative self-efficacy. Okay, so self-efficacy is the belief that you can accomplish what you set out to do. Creative self-efficacy, then, the belief that you can accomplish what you set out to do, even though you've never done it before, or in a way that you've never done before. Okay, and we believe that that feeling can be learned and can be incentivized and can grow. How can we all believe that we can accomplish what we set out to do, even though we don't know what it's going to end up being, right? So I'm going to share, go back to the slides here and share this very short clip of David talking about why creativity is important. And this is from several years ago. He was on a news program here in the US called 60 Minutes. And then we'll go from there. Here we go.
It is said about you that you have gone from design to design thinking to the guru of creativity.
I don't think I want to be the guru of creativity. That sounds like too difficult. No, yeah, we have gone from design to design thinking, and I'm very proud of that. What I really care now about is that, and this had a lot to do with my cancer, you know, that recommitting to this, which is that I really know that everybody's creative. I mean, I know it because at the D School and at IDEO, we take these people who've opted out of some point in their childhood or something, have opted out of being creative and said, you know, I'm just not the creative type, right? And so I'm going to stick to this. And then we bring them in and we hold their hand and they have those series of small successes. And at one point you see them flip and they say, oh my God, I'm a creative person. And that's the candy for me, watching that flip to, and so I want to, this for the rest of my life, I want to do is flip as many people individually and flip as many organizations as possible. So
flip them into what?
Self-confidence about creativity. that they think, I mean, think about the world where people are walking around thinking about themselves as they're creative, and they're trying new things all the time. And, you know, there's a psychologist at Stanford called Albert Bandura, and he calls this stuff self-efficacy. And he's proven this with all kinds of studies and stuff. And you look up Albert Bandura sometime. He's a big dude, you know, like in the league of, you know, Freud and Skinner and those kind of guys. Anyway,
It's a big league.
It's a big league, and he believes in this, that you can attain self-efficacy. You can attain a sense of the world that you can do what you set out to do, and that's exactly the track I'm on.
My theory is that sometimes life squeezes out the best of us.
I've never heard that, but that really resonates with me, right? That your habit of what you think you should do. I have so many students that their parents, that are world-class designers, and their parents, out of love for them, said to them, you should be a doctor, you should be a lawyer, you should be, you know, something like that, a business person. And they were born to be designers, in my opinion, some of them. And so that kind of, like, I find so many people in life do something that looks good but feels bad. If it feels bad, they shouldn't be doing it, right? I mean, and I really think that once you think of yourself as a creative person, you make better decisions. Mm-hmm. If you think of yourself as creative, then, you know, oh, I can do this. I could change direction. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just so empowering. It's basically being positive about the future. If you think of yourself as creative, right, then you can create a new future.
Okay, let's talk about the future for just a minute. So there's a lot of jargon that comes out of this part of the world. If you've been to San Francisco or if you've been out to Stanford, you know we're right in the heart of Silicon Valley, surrounded by all of these giant tech companies. Many of these companies actually got their start right on Stanford campus. So Stanford is very linked to Silicon Valley and vice versa. One of my favorite sort of jargon terms, because it's just sort of funny, is this idea of a unicorn company. Okay, so a unicorn company in the startup language is a private company that reaches a valuation of more than $1 billion US, right? So before they go public, before a company gets acquired, has a valuation of more than $1 billion. Now, valuation, not real money, right? Speculative. It's usually value based off of investment vis-a-vis equity return, right? So if I give you $100 million for 10% of your company, then on paper, you are now worth $1 billion. So from 2011 to 2013, these were the new unicorns, right? You can see that some of these companies eventually went public and became billion-dollar companies, Uber, Airbnb, some others that were doing very well before the pandemic. Some never went public at all, still private companies, and some no longer exist. Didn't reach the potential that their investors thought they might. Here's what happened in the next 3 years. These are the new unicorn companies. So this space just really took off, and especially globally, and especially in Asia, you can see a lot of different logos in there and languages other than English. If you look right in the middle there, I thought this was kind of interesting. I just noticed this the other day. Moderna is right there in January 2015. I bet Moderna is still doing very well, given that they're one of the big vaccine companies for COVID. Recently, I just looked this up, even a year into the pandemic, as of March, there were more than 600 companies globally with a valuation of more than $1 billion US, private companies. And there's a new jargon term called a decacorn, which is private company with a valuation of more than $10 billion. Okay, so totally made up word. Decacorns don't exist. Unicorns might not exist either, but I like to think that they do. But if you look at this and you think about the future, and you think about how technology is changing all of our lives, or if you prefer to think about, you know, public health or climate change or any of the other things that are beyond our control who affect all of us, this brings me to our second polling question. Okay, so here's the second question. And again, this is anonymous. Do you think that life in the future will be less complex than it is now, about the same in complexity as it is now, or more complex than it is now? Now, it depends on how you think about complexity. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just your personal opinion. I'll give you a little bit of time here to consider this. Okay, a couple more seconds. Okay. Interesting outcomes. So about 60% of you say increasingly complex, 30% about the same, and around 10% less complex than it is now. Does anyone want to share their thinking here, especially in the two that got fewer answers? Anybody around the less complex or about the same in complexity want to share how you think about complexity in the future?
Justin, I'm happy to. So I said less complex,
Yeah, thanks.
and my thinking on that was, you've got loads of really smart people doing really smart things, and some of that has to be. There's just this huge opportunity to simplify complexity. So I think there's that element, and then I think other things that are, I guess we've had existential challenges in the last year.
Yes.
Similarly on the environment, huge existential challenges. It feels like we've flushed out loads of the huge problems, and now minds are turning to how you solve those.
Yeah.
So it was that kind of angle I was coming from, that I think minds are turning the way to simplifying complexity rather than this sort of proliferation of things.
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Francis. Yeah, I mean, there are, taking really complex issues and simplifying them. I like that perspective. Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else want to share? And in the chat as well, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Justin. Hi, this is Dev. So I said it would be about the same complexity, because I think each period you're in has its own complexities. So I would suggest that our grandparents had their own level of complexity that if we were put in their place, we would think life is very complex. Similarly, if we went into the future, things might be simpler from our perspective, but from their perspective would be just as complex. So I think it's all relative depending on where you are.
Yeah, what is your perspective? Yeah, and if you hang around with young people like I get to at Stanford, or if you have children, things that I find complex are not complex for them at all, right? They're much more comfortable with new technology and things like that. Okay, great. Thank you, Dev. Let's do one more. Anyone else want to share? Even if you think it's more complex now, we'll add you to the conversation. Anyone want to share how you think about the future?
I said that it will be approximately the same, and I think it's similar sentiment to people. I don't think we can live without complexity. At the same time, I think the type of complexity will change, and how we approach the complexities will also change. But if we think about, for example, now many organizations that talk about upskilling, and what they talk about is the social and personal skills more than they talk about the technical skills. So of course the digital awareness and ability is important, but I think the complexity comes from younger generations may not necessarily be as good as previous generations in actually managing relationships and understanding their own kind of place in life and their own value. So that probably will add to complexity.
Yeah, interesting.
But overall it will be probably the same.
Thank you, Eugenia. Yeah, that's really interesting, especially with the younger generation focused more on screens maybe than face-to-face, and what are the impacts of that in terms of managing people and things of that nature. Okay, great. Thank you all. I tend to think of complexity as personal and the number of decisions that I have to make, right? And many of you, the majority of you said that you think that life will be more complex in the future. And I suspect that maybe you think similar to me, that complexity in a sense is about cognitive load. And even as technology enables individual tasks to be performed easier, I tend to fill up the extra time I get with more and more tasks, right? And so it feels like there's more and more to do and more decisions to make every day. And that can start to feel sort of overwhelming. But whether you think of complexity that way or not, if you do think of complexity in the sense of that the future will be more complex than it is now, then I just want to point out, language-wise, that means that today is as simple as it gets, right? If the world is getting increasingly complex, then today is as simple as it gets. And that can be a scary statement if today doesn't feel very simple. And honestly, it doesn't feel simple to me. It feels like there's a lot going on. But regardless of how you think about complexity in the future, I think one thing that the pandemic has taught us is that the future is not entirely in our control. And the reason why I bring this up in thinking about the future is because one of the great values of design thinking is its inherent optimism about not knowing what is to come, right? For many of us, not knowing what is to come is pretty uncomfortable. But with design thinking, because it's really about trying to understand people in their context, understand their behavior. Anytime human behavior is changing, which is essentially all the time these days, but anytime human behavior is changing, design thinking tools and ways of working can help us understand those behavior changes, right? To get to needs that people may have, and then apply what we're good at in order to create something that helps them on their path, right? So to me, the super simple definition of design thinking is it's trying to understand people in their context, understand emerging needs that they have, and then taking what you're good at to make something to help them, right? And we're all good at different things, but if we're all doing that, right, then there's a real optimism and purpose, right? When the world is changing the way that it is, we can't just stay where we are. We have a purpose, we have a responsibility to help each other move forward and respond to the things that are happening, right? And so I think there's an inherent motivation there and inspiration and optimism there. And oftentimes that optimism is what allows us to move into that unknown, right? It becomes the momentum for not just as individuals, but for teams, right? When we're working on trying to create something that's never been done, that's really uncomfortable. If we can say, yes, but we can understand the people we're trying to design for, and we can use what we're good at to, you know, help them, then that's an inherent motivation. Okay, so there's optimism baked into how you approach challenges with design thinking. Okay, so we are going to spend our time today talking about the context of design thinking, where it's useful, really talking about how it's understanding behaviors, right? And designing for behaviors, incentivizing behaviors. We're going to talk a bit about the design thinking hexagons. If you've ever seen those before, we'll get to those in just a little bit. We're going to talk about empathy and define and the tools attached to that. When we get to tomorrow's session, we're going to talk more about a prototyping mindset and how to embrace this learn as you go way of working. I'm going to give you some examples that are product focused and some that are experience focused. And even though you all are working in HR, right, and probably not directly related to products, the principles are the same. The approaches that we're taking, whether we're designing for an internal behavior or whether we're designing for reaching customers where they are, we're going to talk about what is the behavioral design that's happening in this example, okay? And when we get to the third session next week, we're going to really dive into some of the organization design principles that I teach at Stanford, things like organizational ambidexterity and the ARC framework and all kinds of different tools in that way, okay? So that's kind of the arc of our 3 sessions together. Each thing that we learn is going to build on the previous one. And so even if you have to drop out or you miss a piece, you come back and I'll continue to repeat myself and bring you up to speed, but just know that in this learning, it accelerates as we go, okay? So continuing with the context of design thinking and where it's valuable within an organization, I love this quote from Melinda Gates. So we do a lot of work with the Gates Foundation over the years at the D School. And a couple of years ago, Wired Magazine, which is an innovation and technology magazine based here in San Francisco, they did an interview with Melinda. And this was the question that they asked her first. What innovation do you think is changing the most lives in the developing world? Right. And of course, the Gates Foundation invests and gives away a lot of money to solve issues, complex multi-stakeholder issues like malaria in Africa and things like that. But Melinda didn't say a vaccine for malaria or even the rise of mobile access in Africa, which is an innovation that is changing a lot of lives there. Instead, she said human-centered design. But what I think is interesting about this is not just that it's what I teach, but it's also interesting to me that she didn't say an outcome, right? We often think of innovation as the thing, as the product, as the service, as the technology, right? Artificial intelligence or self-driving cars or whatever it may be, right? The next big thing. But instead, she said, a way of working. It's really about connecting with the people you're trying to serve. And in many cases, then co-designing with them, bringing them into the process in order to collectively create something together that you wouldn't be able to create on your own. And what I think is significant about this is that when we are outcome focused, when we are focused on innovations as the outcomes, there is always going to be another outcome, right? No matter what we create, even if it's at the edge of our industry, the impact of that advantage is not going to last forever. And in fact, it's lasting shorter and shorter because technology, we're on this exponential curve of technological change, right? So if we're only outcome focused when we think of innovations and there's always going to be another outcome, that can really wear you down. It can wear your team down, can wear your organization down. You'll always feel behind no matter what you've accomplished in the moment. Another challenge with that is that sometimes you haven't even finished the thing you're working on and you know that it's already out of date. When I was at the Washington Post, one year we were redesigning the website, right? And we were 8 months into this website redesign. It was going to launch the next month, but we already knew that what we were launching the next month was behind. So we were already working on version 2 before we launched version 1. I don't know if you have your own example of that, but wouldn't surprise me if you did, right? So when we are outcome focused and there's always going to be another outcome, that can feel a little deflating at times. So with design thinking, what we're really focused on is instead of thinking of innovations, we think about innovators. How do we unlock ways of working in people that are going to allow us to consistently come up with creative ideas for products and services and technologies, right? So it's about the innovators before the innovations. It's about the people and accelerating different ways of working for them that will then build this sort of creativity engine within the organization where you have a lot of choices for outcomes that you might pursue. Okay, and we'll talk about how to make those choices and how we use design thinking to make those choices a little bit later on. So design thinking is not an end unto itself, right? It's not something that, oh, if you just learn these tools and this process, then follow it like a prescription and you too will create a unicorn company. It's not that way. It's much more like learning to play a sport or learning a skill, right? Just because you're good at football doesn't make you, oh shoot, I'm trying to think of the top footballers in the UK, but I just can't come up with it. Gareth Bale, let's say, okay? You have to practice, you have to get better, you have to, you have different teammates, you have different opponents, right? So the more you use it, the more it becomes useful for you and the more you can sort of self-navigate which tools and processes to deploy when, given the situation that you're facing. This slide I'm showing now is just a little bit about how design thinking is complementary with other ways of working. I know a lot of organizations now are using lean startup and they're using agile. If you're in a tech organization, things like that. What design thinking is really most useful for, in my opinion, is on that problem side. We start with a challenge we're trying to address. And now we're going to engage the people who are affected by that challenge in order to now incorporate their point of view into how we think about the problem. And as we do that, we get to a new problem frame. And as we do that, now we start to get to creative problem solving and brainstorming new ideas. And where we intersect often with lean and agile is when we get into the rapid prototyping cycle. Okay, so it's not either or. And I'm not going to try to convince you to stop whatever it is you're doing and use design thinking for everything. It's not useful for everything, although I believe it's useful wherever people are involved, which is most things. But it's really great on the understanding side. How do we understand the people that we're trying to serve with this challenge? A little bit more about where design intersects in different sectors. So it used to be that design was really about creating new products. And then it became new experiences, and that was added to that sort of portfolio. Increasingly at the D School, we're working more on systems. So as I mentioned, I teach organization design. I think of organization design as a system, whether it's in an individual company or multiple companies or nonprofits or whatever it might be, governments and schools and movements, right? Systems design. Technologies, of course, we've always been working on those, especially here in this part of the world. Data, right? How do we design for algorithms, big and small? And then more and more in the last couple of years, implications, right? So what are the implications of the products and services and experiences and technologies that we design? So we have a whole curriculum for that now with our students. How might someone use the new thing that you create in a negative way that you didn't intend, right? And I think we can all agree that's very important to consider, especially in technology. So a lot of different applications of these ways of working in toward different outcomes. But again, it's the people who create the outcomes. So we focus on the people first. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back now, and please put any questions you have in the chat, because I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about sort of the intention around deploying design thinking within an organization. Okay, and one of the great values of working in this way is because it helps us generate new ideas. These new ideas or these possibilities, this creativity engine that I mentioned a minute ago, right, generates new knowledge within the organization. And with new knowledge, we still have to make decisions about how we want to deploy our resources, right? The feasibility and that Venn diagram I mentioned. But new knowledge helps us make more informed decisions. The more knowledge we create in the workings of our organization, the more interesting possibilities we have to make decisions about, okay? Now, it's more difficult to make decisions with more knowledge, but I think we all would like to have more knowledge in order to create more interesting decisions. All right, so this is called knowledge management, and the pioneer of knowledge management is a professor in Japan named Ikejiro Nanaka. And Nanaka talks about two kinds of knowledge, right? So there is explicit knowledge, and explicit knowledge is quantifiable knowledge, right? So when you create a product and the product costs, a certain amount of money per part, per unit, and there's a supply chain and there's deliverables and what you know about your customer base and their geography and their age and their socioeconomic status, like all of those things, anything that is data is explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is very easy to share because it's quantifiable. Okay. Now, on the other side, Nanaka talks about tacit knowledge or implicit knowledge. Now, tacit knowledge is what you learn by doing. This is where your experience comes in. Okay. I love his example. He talks about riding a bike. You can understand how a bicycle works. You can understand how the gears work and the pedals and the steering mechanism and the speed and the wind resistance and all of those things. But understanding all of those things doesn't make you good at riding a bike. You have to get on the bike and you have to try it, right? What you learn by doing is how you develop your tacit knowledge. Now, there's explicit knowledge attached to design thinking, and that's what we're talking about, but there's so much more tacit knowledge. It is very much a learn by doing way of working, okay? Now, how do we make knowledgeable decisions? So anytime we are working in something that generates quantified knowledge, now we have that type of knowledge from which to make decisions about. But when we try new things, when we try something we haven't done before, right? We talk about those inevitable mistakes that we make, the failures that happen when we try something we haven't done before, because remember, anytime you try something you haven't done, you're going to make mistakes. Those mistakes are not really failures, they're learning. How do we quantify what we learn from those experiences in order to generate new knowledge, in order to move toward, previously unimaginable outcomes? So very quickly in some of this sort of academic theory and framework, I'm sure some of you will enjoy this. If you don't enjoy this, it won't take that long, I promise. So organizations generate knowledge essentially in two ways, if you boil it down: by working on your core products and services, right? The things that have made you a successful organization in the first place, and by working toward new things. What are the new things that you're going to create? Okay, a couple of professors, Dan Leventhal at Wharton, University of Pennsylvania, and Jim March at Stanford, they say that working on the core is really marked by exploitation. Exploitation is a pretty negative word, but what they mean is exploiting the resources that you have, time, money, employees, effort, right, toward a predetermined outcome, right? If this is our core business, here's the target that we're trying to hit. Let's hit this target with precision and consistency, exploit our resources toward that outcome with the margin that we need to achieve. right? But on the other side, the new is marked by exploration, right? We don't know exactly what's out there. And so we're going to learn as we go. Now, a mentor to me is a gentleman named Charles O'Reilly, who teaches at the business school here at Stanford. And in his research, he's found that exploitation, hitting the target with precision and consistency, is something that large organizations are really good at, right? I'd call this incremental innovation, getting better at the things that we've always done, continuous improvement, so forth. But exploration, trying to figure out what we might do, large organizations are not good at this at all. And part of the reason is because organizations don't understand the need to manage these differently. The things that make us good at incremental improvement are not the same skills that make us good at discovering what might be next, right? And in fact, all of the day-to-day in most organizations is pointed toward the present, the core, right? Here's the thing we did yesterday. Let's continue to do this. We have a meeting about it tomorrow. We don't just sit around and say, oh, how can we take time just exploring the future, right? Hey, every Friday we're going to explore the future, right? So the present is just much more immediate, and we get pulled into the present. And this is why organizations are consistently disrupted, because if we're only working on the future part-time, and newcomers to our industry, right, potential disruptors, are working on the future full-time because they don't have customers yet, so they have to focus on the future, then they're going to get there faster than we are, right? So if you're familiar with The Innovator's Dilemma, which is a great book by Clay Christensen, he talks about how market leaders are consistently disrupted because you only work on the future part-time, right? And the reason why you do that, the reason we're vulnerable as market leaders, is because we have current customers and we have to serve those customers in the present. Okay, so it's, again, nobody's fault. This is just sort of human dynamics, right? But if we can learn about the skills that make us good at the future and how they're different from the skills that make us good at the present, then we can be intentional about making decisions toward which way we're working. If we're focused on incremental innovation, then let's work on planning, executing, and repeating. If we're trying to explore what might be possible, let's generate new ideas, let's incubate the ones that show promise, and let's scale the ones that work. So incentivizing different behaviors in the innovators, depending on whether we're working on the core toward incremental innovation or on the new toward potentially transformational innovation. Okay, does that all make sense? I hope so. Okay, so Charles has done all of this longitudinal research with the global 500 companies around the world. And what he's found is that this split of resource allocation, right, on the feasibility side, how organizations allocate their resources, it's not 50-50. 50, half the resources toward the present and half toward the future. It actually looks more like this. 96.8% are focused on incremental improvement on the core. All right, and 3.2% of resources are focused on exploring the future. That's how powerful the core is. Now, there's not a right or wrong here. Okay, if you have a clear market advantage, then by all means, focus all your resources on, monopolizing or taking advantage of that advantage. But as you start to see that advantage erode, either through competition or changes beyond your control or new technologies or whatever it might be, then you want to devote more resource allocation to exploration. So in my classes, we use this as a framework to say, hey, in your organization, what do you think the resource allocation is? Is it 90% exploit, 10% explore? Is it 80-20? Is it 70-30? How can we look at this as a case study with other organizations, right? What do you think Tesla's allocation is right now? What do you think Apple Computer's allocation is, right? And you'll see organizations that are successful, they change the ratio over time as they start to evolve and create new revenue streams. All right, we're not going to go into that level of conversation right now, but I just want to give you this sort of high level view. When we're working on core incremental innovation, improving the things that already create, we want to incentivize certain behaviors. When we are working on the new and exploring what might be possible, we want to incentivize and be intentional about different behaviors. And we're largely going to focus on those different behaviors because design thinking is really useful on the explore side. Okay. So if we zoom in now on this little corner, okay, and we're talking about generating ideas, incubating ideas, and scaling ideas. What design thinking is really helpful with is generating new ideas. because we work in different ways, because we connect with the people we're trying to serve, there are lots of ways of working with design thinking that help us discover possibilities, not the outcomes, but possibilities that we wouldn't otherwise discover if we were just sort of parsing explicit knowledge, looking at the data, right? Focusing on improving what already exists. So when you lead for the exploration, what you're doing is you're generating as many ideas as you can, and then you're chipping away at those ideas to get to the transformational innovation inside. So this is a little bit of a mindset challenge for a lot of us, and for myself included, right? When you work in this way, it's not so much about saying, hey, here's where we're starting. Let's come up with the most creative idea we can and then move toward that outcome, right? Like your goal is not to come up with the answer or two answers, right, that are very different than what you currently do in a linear way. Instead, what we're trying to do is come up with as many possible answers as we can. So the metaphor I've been thinking a lot about lately is it's sort of like a sculptor, right? Like I'm not an artist in that way, I'm not a sculptor, maybe some of you are, right? But when you're sculpting a statue, you start with the rock, right? You start with the piece of marble, this big old amorphous piece of the material, and then you chip away at it to get to the art inside. And this is exactly how design thinking helps us develop a lot of ideas, come up with a lot of ideas, and then prototype our way forward to get to the innovation inside. So it's a different mentality than going straight from problem to answer. So what does it take to lead for this exploratory capability? Well, to get a good idea, you need a lot of ideas, right? You need a big old rock. And then we're going to learn our way forward in order to see which ones work. So there are a couple of ways that design thinking helps us generate a lot of ideas. And I'm going to talk about this for a minute, and then we're going to get into a longer activity around this, okay? So one way that design thinking helps us generate a lot of ideas is by working in multidisciplinary teams. Okay, one thing that we've learned over the years, and not just us, but there's a lot of research that shows this as well, is that diversity is the core of creativity, right? And it makes sense. If you are only working with people who have similar skill sets to you, who have similar life experiences to you, who come from similar backgrounds, then you are much more likely to come up with incremental ideas. You might agree faster because you understand each other easier because you have so many things in common, right? But you're more likely to come up with incremental outcomes in your space because you see problems from similar perspectives and you have similar skills in order to address those problems, all right? If you work with people who are fundamentally different from you, who have different skill sets, different life experiences, different backgrounds, there's likely to be more conflict because you don't understand each other as well at first, but it's in that conflict that the new ideas emerge. It's in the collisions of our differences that the most interesting things rise to the top. Now, the thing is, we have to be intentional about diversity because most of us, we build personal relationships, at least initially, based off of what we have in common. You like that sport team, I like that sport team. Let's go see those sport team play, right? Whatever it is, right? So to work with people who are different from us, who we don't understand, who have different skills, different perspectives, there can be conflict there. So I think collaboration in this way is inherently really about conflict, and most of us try to avoid conflict. But what we're trying to do is make that conflict constructive. It's not personal. It's that I know that if I work with you, then together we could create something that I couldn't create on my own, or I couldn't create if I were right all the time, right? And so we have to be intentional about seeking out people who are different from us. Here's how we do that at the D School, and this is what this slide is about. When the D School first got started at Stanford, David Kelly and some of his colleagues, they looked around campus, they said, these students are really smart, but they tend to hang out on their area of campus with other people in the same program, right? The business students are working with each other at the business school, the medical students are at the hospital, law students are at the law school, engineers are in engineering, right? And when they work in that way, they're more likely to come up with incremental ideas. So what if we created a place where students come together from all across the university and take classes together and build on each other's ideas to get to previously unimaginable outcomes? And so that's how the D School is constructed. We don't have degrees in design thinking. we teach elective courses to primarily Stanford graduate students. Because of that setup and because they have to apply to get into our classes, even though they're electives, we draw students from all across campus. It's the only place at the university where students come from every program and take classes together. So what happens when you get a computer science graduate student together with a molecular biologist and someone getting a PhD in symbolic systems, right? I'll be honest, I don't know what symbolic systems is. I think it sounds amazing, right? But they have a depth of discipline in different areas. If we can teach them a way of working together, then they might together create something that they wouldn't on their own. This is a list of student study areas from just one of our recent classes, sort of this breadth of discipline, all coming together in one class, working together in small multidisciplinary teams, using this human-centered approach to get to creative outcomes for real people's challenges. If you're, don't know a lot about this, there's so much research now around how diverse teams are more creative. I don't know if it's that they're smarter. I'm not sure this headline captures it quite right, but remember, I'm a journalist, so I'm probably a little more picky about headlines. But in the collision of our differences is where creativity really emerges. Okay, so one way we generate ideas with design thinking is by focusing on that conflict and working in diverse teams. A second way that we do this, and this one's pretty obvious, we've talked about this, is by getting proximate with the people that we're seeking to serve, right? This is a picture of my colleague, George Kimball, who was our founding executive director. And he's working with some journalists here from WNYC, the public radio station in New York. And this is before COVID. And they were interested in how people get their news during their morning commute to work. It turns out one of the best ways to understand how people get their news during their morning commute to work is to go talk to people during their morning commute to work. So this is the train, the Caltrain platform, which is a commuter train, runs up to San Francisco and down to San Jose. And this is the station in Palo Alto, and we took the furniture out there, and George is talking about how you interview people for empathy. And the next moment the train comes in, they get on the train, they start to observe and have conversations with strangers about what they're reading and how they understand what's happening in the world as they make their way to work. Okay. Now, when we do this kind of empathy work, it's not to go out and ask people, hey, what do you think we should do? Right? I'm from the Washington Post. What do you want us to do differently? Or I'm from the D School. What did you think about this? How could I improve it? Those kinds of conversations are important, but it's not the same, because those kind of conversations are really more about you than it is about the people you're trying to learn more about. You're asking for their opinion about what you do, right? And their opinion about what you do is almost always going to be incremental, right? They're going to say, oh, I wish you did this differently, or I wish you cost less, or I wish, right? And so we're not after the incremental. We can't expect people that we talk to about us to be able to articulate the thing that doesn't yet exist. That's the point of this quote from Henry Ford, right? There's no such thing as automobiles yet. So no one's going to say, hey, I wish you could make an automobile. Instead, what we're trying to do is we're trying to uncover things that people need. We're trying to notice, right? Things that they need, things that might be meaningful to them. We're going to go deeper into this in a little bit, right? And then we take our expertise. What's the thing that we're good at that we can then act on that need in order to create the thing that hasn't been done? In this case, if you're Henry Ford, you're sort of tinkering with combustible engines, right? That's something he was interested in. People said they wanted to go faster. What if I put, a place to sit around this combustible engine? What if I create a steering mechanism? And then, eventually, voila, we have an automobile. Okay. So you're not going to people and asking them what they think of you. You're trying to understand them and their life and their context. You get a lot of new ideas that way. And then the third one, and we're going to jump into an activity around this in just a second, is what we call experiential learning. So all of our courses are project-based, right? And we work with real organizations on real challenges. And what we mean by experiential learning is simply learn as you go. We don't know, as the teachers of the classes at the beginning of the class, what the outcomes are going to be, nor are we prescribing them. We have a domain that we're applying them within, right? Like we're applying design thinking to, new companies and startup class, or we're applying it to, healthcare solutions and navigating healthcare, or whatever it might be. We have lots of different classes, but we don't know where the students are going to end up, because if we knew where they're going to end up before we got started, it's probably not something that's never been done. No one can consistently predict the future, the thing that's going to impact the future in a positive way that doesn't currently exist. Even if you can do that once in your life, it's not a sustainable approach to transformational innovation, to creating things that have never been done. Okay. So instead, we have an idea about something. We say, what can we try in order to learn more about that idea? And then what we learn from that experiment determines our next step. And what we learn from that experiment determines our next step, and so on and so forth. So by the time we get to the 10th, 11th, 12th step, we can look back at where we started and say, wow, we're in a place that we never could have imagined. And that's how we know we're on the right track to creating something that hasn't been done. Okay, so this isn't rocket science, and most of the tools of design thinking are not really new, but they can be surprisingly hard to implement. Experiential learning, or learn as you go, is hard because it's uncomfortable to not know where you're going to end up, right? Most of us like to know what we're trying to achieve when we get started on a project. So how do we hold that space of uncomfortability, right? How do we help navigate and guide a team through that uncertainty and use that uncertainty to their advantage, knowing that it's in the uncertainty that we're going to find something that hasn't been done, right? So we call that experiential learning. We have a whole curriculum now around navigating the ambiguity of the unknown, right? Between finding a problem that's rooted in a deep need of the people we're trying to serve, and then trying to solve that problem in a unique way, a creative way, right? And we call this navigating ambiguity. So we're going to get to an activity around this in just a second. What we mean by navigating ambiguity is sort of stewing in this comfort of not knowing. Instead of trying to jump straight to an answer, which gets us out of the uncertainty or ambiguity of not knowing, we stay there. We say, this is interesting. How can we explore the parameters of this problem we're trying to solve? How can we use this ambiguity as a competitive advantage, right? Because we know from a rational perspective that discovery only exists within the unknown. If we're trying to create something that hasn't been done, we have to be in the unknown in order to find the thing that hasn't been done before, right? We're not going to discover something new within what is already known. So how do we use this ambiguity, not as a barrier to overcome, but as an advantage, as a way to spot possibilities and then explore them? We use a lot of metaphors in our teaching, and the executive director of the D School, my friend and colleague Sarah, she does a lot of deep sea diving. This is something she really loves to do in her own time. And so she thinks of navigating ambiguity as like ocean exploration, right? Because you're jumping from the safety of the boat into the unknown. What are we going to see today under the water, right? And when you see that ambiguity as an opportunity, right? Part of the reason why you do that, part of the reason why you go diving, is to see things that you couldn't have predicted that you were going to see before you jump into the ocean, right? So there's an excitement there about the possibilities. Now, when you're diving, right, when you're close to the boat, Sarah calls this the splash zone. This is where you're sort of swimming around, you're seeing some pretty fish, but you can still see the boat, so you're still pretty safe. You could swim over there if you need to. The deeper you go, now you get into more discomfort. Oh, it would take me longer to get back to the boat. The fish are getting bigger. This is a little bit dangerous. When you push through that discomfort, that's where you get to real discovery, right? Down at the bottom of the ocean is where species that no one's seen before really exist. So to draw this analogy back to teamwork on a project, sometimes we're close to the boat and we're in the splash zone, we get down to discomfort, we come back up, then we push ourselves down to discovery, right? So we're sort of navigating through these different levels of ambiguity or uncertainty. Okay, we are going to do an activity now. And I'm going to come back so I can see all of your faces and see that everyone is still here. Okay, good. All right, so here's what we're going to do in just a second. All you need is a piece of paper, like printer style paper, something around that size if you're in your home office. Okay, so I'll give you a second to grab that before we get into what we're going to do with it. And we're going to do an activity around navigating ambiguity. And the reason we're doing this is to help you self-discover your own sort of techniques and tactics for how you navigate ambiguity in your life or in your work. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do this activity, and then I'm going to put you into a room with someone else, right? We're doing this randomly, and you're going to walk them through your worksheet, that you're about to do. And then we'll come back, we'll have a little discussion about it, and then I'll tell you what we've learned about different tactics. There's sort of 3 different tactics that we've discovered that people use to navigate ambiguity. All right. Okay, so let me go back to the screen now. So here's what I want you to do. I just want you to draw 3 circles on your piece of paper, like you see here on the right side of the screen. Okay, so it's kind of like a target in a sense. So in the inner circle is you're going to label this as the self. And the next circle out is the team, and the next circle out is the project, right? Or challenge that you're working on. And now the instructions are over here on the left. You don't have to write these instructions down. Just draw the 3 circles. And what I want you to do personally is just to think back on a time when you recently experienced ambiguity or uncertainty in your life. Okay, this could be in a professional context when you were working on a new project or with new people. It could be in a personal context. I think we all have a lot of recent experiences of uncertainty personally, given what's happened in the last year. Okay, and some questions you might consider for yourself to help think of an experience that you had is, when was a time when your next steps were unclear? You weren't sure what to do. Or you had so many possibilities to explore, you weren't sure which one to pick, right? Or you faced more questions than answers. Or your personal perception of what is right was challenged. Okay, so it could be or any of those things, or and any of those things. And as you think about this moment, I want you to sort of populate your circles, jot down within those different circles, how did you feel when this was happening and how did you respond? Okay, so in the self circle, you're going to say, here's how I felt. In the team circle, you're going to say, here's how our team wrestled with this. And if it's a personal thing, your team could be your family, or it could be your community, your school, or whatever it is. However you, who are you facing this uncertainty with? Okay, so how did I feel as an individual? How did my team or community or family respond? And then what impact, right? How did that impact the project or the outcome of that uncertainty? Again, you get to choose the experience and you get to choose what you write down. But think about it through these 3 different lenses, sort of the I, the we, and the it, the self, the team, and the project. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do this. We'll all stay here together. I'll try to put on some thoughtful music to sort of spur our thinking. And after about 4 minutes, then we'll put you into a room with one other person, and you'll take turns sort of sharing your experience of uncertainty. And you can decide at what depth, obviously, that you want to share. And we're not going to ask you to send these sheets in or anything like that. Okay, so this is personal. So I'm going to stop this for just a second. I'm going to put some music on, and then I'll come back to this so that you can see this worksheet as you write it down. Okay. Okay, welcome back, everyone. And apologies if I pulled you out of your conversation mid-sentence. It's hard to know in Zoom where you are with that. But thank you all for doing that activity. Before we move ahead, I would love to hear from anyone who wants to share. Did anything come up for you in that mapping of the self and the team and the project that help you understand about how you navigate ambiguity in your own life? What are some of the tactics that you use to use that uncertainty to your advantage, or to move through it, if you will? Anyone want to share a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, I'm happy to share if that's okay.
Great,
so
thanks.
I don't know if this is a way I use to navigate ambiguity, but just thinking about it made me realize in the situation I was thinking of how keen I was to get out of ambiguity as quickly as possible. And like that was, it was like, oh, now I don't know. Oh, I want to get things clear again. And other people wanted to get things clear again. And that was a real driver to kind of get through the ambiguity as quickly as possible. And actually, on reflection, with hindsight, perhaps I was a bit too much in a rush to get to that point.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. I think that I think viewing ambiguity as an obstacle is something that we all kind of experience in different types of ambiguity, depending on what that is. Yeah, and I think part of what I'm hearing from you is part of the challenge is to know when to stay with it and say, oh, there might be something more here, right? And when to say, let's just get out of this. You know, So yeah, different situations. Thanks for sharing. Appreciate that. Yes, Natasha raised your hand.
Thank you. What I realized is that, yes, if it depends on the driver, what the situation is. If you are feeling just anxious about something that you definitely want to get out of it as soon as possible, and it's really hard to stay in this situation, but when you're also excited about this, about something, then you maybe still be nervous, but this excitement that keeps you going is like petrol. It's like, honestly, it's like some kind of really, really positive driver.
Yes.
So it's nice to be excited as well, and that will help, definitely helps push through the ambiguity to whatever the outcome we want to achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Yeah, that's, I mean, so it's how you think of an adventure, right? An adventure is an adventure if there's unknown. If we know what's going to happen, then it doesn't feel as much like an adventure. So that excitement that comes from, yeah.
And I think the neuroscience says that there is a seeking system and a fear system. And when there is seeking system is activated, that's what you actually makes you excited and you're like adventurer or explorer. But the fear system is kind of shuts down all the other systems.
Yes.
And you just is extremely uncomfortable, and you can't be creative when you are nervous about something or scared.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to share? Yes, Kate.
Hello, somewhere in between of those two very interesting viewpoints, where I found myself often in the last couple of years, because I naturally gravitate towards high ambiguity environments, is the need for, and I think you talked about it, Justin, a need for self-awareness where others are on this comfort and change journey, and really dialing up and down the excitement so people don't feel almost either coerced to put up with ambiguity, or feel like someone already resolved it, so it's nothing for them to contribute. So it's a really interesting balance between those two.
Yes, yes, thank you, Kate. And I think what you're getting to too is sort of how do you facilitate people through ambiguity, right? So I'm very curious about that as well, since you all have probably a lot of experience with that in your jobs. Like, what are some of the ways that you help people embrace change or the uncertainty of not knowing? If we think about moving to the team circle, from the self circle to the team circle in the activity, anyone want to share? What are some of the tactics you use to help people with their own ambiguity?
If I start, because I brought the topic up,
Sure.
What my teams told me they found helpful was being honest where we can't provide any certainty, and then pick areas where we can, and almost in a similar way as we had circles in this exercise, those are things we can be 100% sure about, even if nothing will change for the next 3 months. This is where we can make assumptions, and again, being clear about how we arrived at the assumptions, and what we factored in, what we haven't. And the whole premise of design thinking really speaks to that, because it's inviting very diverse views, because it's so easy, particularly with, I use the expression myself, I'm comfortable with change. This means there are areas where I have massive blind spots. So I desperately need and always seek people on my team who are polar opposites, because they will see through those blind spots and will go with, yeah, but how about that? And this is how we all gonna hurtle down the cliff if you continue just to be positive about everything.
Yes, thank you, Kate. That's great. Hurtle down the cliff. I love that. Yeah, so that diversity of teams, really important. And I'm also hearing like the transparency of communication, right? Like, we don't have that answer yet, right? And better to address it than not, right? Because then people at least know, they feel that they have that knowledge. Anyone else want to share? What are some of the tactics you use to help guide people through ambiguity? Yeah, Francis.
it's one of the simple ones we talk about. When things kind of start getting overwhelming, and we use a metaphor of it's like putting a tent up in the wind. So the kind of cloth is all flying around, and you say the only way that tent's going up is if you start putting pegs into the ground.
Yeah.
And you put a peg in, and maybe it'll get blown out again, but you've got to keep put one peg in after another. So, and it's just trying to get people to almost like get away from worrying about the whole thing and just get your little wins. Make one thing and then move it on. And it just seems to help people when it kind of captures that sense of sort of feeling out of control.
Yeah.
But those little acts to bring you into control. So it seems to really help as a metaphor to people.
Yeah, that's great. I love that metaphor too, because it seems like once you get 4 or 5 pegs in, you could go back and move the first one if you need to.
Yes,
right? So the
exactly.
pegs don't have to be perfect, right?
Yeah.
But they give us something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. All right, good. Anyone else want to share?
I use a lot of expectation management, right? So just explaining what the process looks like, what to be aware of, understanding where the pain points will likely emerge, and that this is common, and that we're not going through something unique, right? That this is a shared problem. But again, it's a lot of expectation management.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, anytime we're stepping into ambiguity or organizational change, no one has all the answers, right? Because we're moving someplace that we're not sure exactly where we're going to end up, right? So, resisting the urge, for me, it's resisting the urge to have the answers, right? And to instead say, I don't have all the answers, but we're going to discover them together, helping people feel empowered about what we're going to discover, right? Will be better than an answer I could prescribe anyway, right? And together we'll create something better than I could, lead on my own. So yeah, there's a little bit of a letting go that then helps people feel comfortable. Okay, good. I'm going to share a little bit about what we've learned in our work with students at Stanford around navigating ambiguity. And so, as I mentioned, we love these metaphors. And one of the little simple worksheets that we've had hundreds of students do over the last couple of years is this, right? So ambiguity is like what? What is your metaphor? Because why? Ambiguity is like what, because why? And so one of the sort of ways that we articulate how people navigate ambiguity personally is, the first one is about enduring ambiguity. So looking at this uncertainty as antagonistic to the goal, something that you have to overcome in order to get out of it, right? And this is can be kind of our initial reaction as people, personally, with how we deal with uncertainty, right? Oh, I just got to get out of this situation so I can get back to the comfortable of knowing where I am, right? This kind of metaphor came up over and over again with our students. Here's an example. It's like navigating a corn maze in the fog, right? Your goal is to get out of the maze, but you don't know what's going to be around the next corner. So you have to get past it in order to get through it, okay? Another way that we notice that people navigate ambiguity is by engaging with it. And this goes back to sort of the adventure experience, right? Wow, it's exciting because we don't know. But adventures, also to the discussion we just had, they can be very rewarding and helpful, but they can also be dangerous, right? We don't know what's going to happen. And so there could be some dangerous outcomes there. So when your team or people that you're trying to guide or engaging with ambiguity as an adventure, remember that there's exhilaration and there's exhaustion, right? And there's lots of ups and downs. And so helping people through the downs and to move forward can be something to remember, right? It's not all fun adventures aren't fun for everyone, right? Some people see danger where others see reward. And so sort of being mindful of that can help you lead teams through that kind of ambiguity. The example here is the one that I've given already. It's like jumping into the ocean. You don't know the space surrounding you, but you're free to make of it whatever you feel like doing. You can stay in the splash zone where you can still see the boat and get back there pretty easily. Okay. And then the last one, this is what we're really trying to go for when we're working on the new side, on the exploration side, is how do we use ambiguity to our advantage, right? Because knowing that this is where we're going to discover something new. So we call this embracing ambiguity. Ambiguity is ever present, right? It's not something to overcome. It's something for us to explore in order to see something new and then come out of the ambiguity and try that thing and then learn what happens from that in order to change direction, right? Have a plan to change the plan, right? All of those kinds of things. And it requires this sort of patience and practice and encouragement, because when every direction is a possibility, it's hard to know which way to go, right? But we know that by embracing ambiguity, that's where we're going to discover something that hasn't been discovered before. So this is my favorite metaphor from a student. Ambiguity is like falling in love, right? Because it's exciting and terrifying and full of promise. You know, otherwise we might not do it. So for some of these things, just having a language around them, having a shared language and saying, hey, what are we approaching here in our organization? Or are we just trying to get past the obstacles of not knowing, in which case we're probably not leveraging the ambiguity as an advantage? Or are we engaging with it as an adventure, in which case we need to notice when people are scared, or when there's danger, or when they're exhausted rather than exhilarated? Or are we really embracing it? Are we dipping in and out of it, right? Seeing what's possible and then acting on that, and then going back into the unknown, right? And so just having your own language, whether it's this or not, I actually find this a little difficult because they're all E words, which is supposed to make it easier to remember, but it's a little bit hard to discern the difference, I think. But just having your own language around it, then communicating it within the team, right, back to that point about transparency and expectation setting, right, then helps us move forward together into the unknown. Okay, so all of these mindsets and application of design thinking are really wrapped up in this personal and team behavior. Do you believe that you can try something different in order to end up someplace unexpected? Again, that's what we call creative confidence or creative self-efficacy. How do you step into ambiguity collectively, right? All of these kinds of things are the behaviors that are sort of the undercurrents of the tools of design thinking, which is what we're going to talk about next as we get into the hexagons. But before we go to a little break, I just want to share a quick example with you from one of our students. And this is a product example. This is a student who was taking a class with us in order to create a new product, but I want to talk about it through this creative self-efficacy and ambiguity sort of lens. So this young man, his name is Akshay Kathari, and Akshay is from India, and he was a graduate student with us a number of years ago in computer science. He was getting a master's degree in computer science. And Stanford has a very large engineering program, and computer science is a pretty prestigious area to study. A lot of those students go on to work at, Google and Apple and places like that around here, Oracle. And Akshay, like a lot of computer science students, is a little bit like the stereotype of developers and coders. He's a little introverted, kind of more comfortable in front of a computer than he is talking to strangers, right? And so when he got to the end of his degree, he had one more class to take, and actually two more classes to take. And the first class that he took with us was called Introduction to Design Thinking. And in that class, they're learning the principles of design thinking and the tools, and they're working on real challenges because all of our classes are project-based. And in the first project that we typically give students, they have to go out to Stanford Shopping Center, which is the large outdoor mall close to campus. And they have to walk up to strangers and have a conversation with them around a prompt that we give the student teams. And when they got to the mall with Akshay and his team, he was afraid to get out of the car. He did not want to go talk to strangers. It was very uncomfortable for him. Not a small step, but a bigger step. And one of the reasons why we do this in teams is because we can encourage each other, right? So Akshay's team said, hey, come along. We're going to take care of you. Why don't you take notes first so you don't have to ask any of the questions? And as you get more comfortable taking notes, then you can start to ask questions and learn by getting uncomfortable. And so he did. And he started to learn that in these empathy interviews, it's not really about you and how people respond to you. And so it's not really about being accepted or rejected. It's more about being curious about them. And the more you sort of project that curiosity, the less worried you become about how they feel about you, right? And when people don't have time, that's okay too. And you move on and ask somebody else. And so in the course of this class, this 10-week class, Akshay, started to really reframe how he thinks about empathy work and engaging with strangers and learning about them. And by the time he took his last class of his degree, again with us, he knew that talking to people could really help accelerate your learning. And so this last class that he took with us is a class we have called Launchpad. And Launchpad is a startup class. And the students have to apply with a prototype of their company, no matter what their company is. It's not always technology companies. And we accept about 10 student projects into this class. And by the 5th week of the class, they have to launch their company into the world. And by the 10th week of the class, they have to sell a unit of whatever their company is about, or they fail the class. So it's very fast, and that's why we call it Launchpad. They move quickly and learn by doing. So Akshay had an idea for an app for a device that was about to come out. This is 2009, a device that was about to come out called the iPad. So if you put yourself in a time machine and go back to, 10 or so years ago, a little bit more than that now, and you think about when the iPad first came out, before tablets were ubiquitous, it was a curious new device. It was kind of expensive. Do I really need this thing? And also, does it have to look the same in portrait mode as in landscape mode? And, how are we going to use this thing, right? And so Akshay, he had this idea for a company that would pull information from publishers, right? So news stories, it's a news aggregator app. But what he had no idea about was how people wanted to navigate the design of it. What should the design look like? Should it look the same in both orientations? And how are people going to use this new device? So his first prototype was a piece of cardboard, okay, from a box that he cut out, and he had color-coded Post-it notes. And he put the Post-it notes either in the same color going horizontally in rows, or in the same color going vertically in columns. And every day he would go to this coffee shop where this picture is, which is on University Avenue in downtown Palo Alto. This is like Main Street, right across from campus. And he would go up to people and say, hey, you've probably heard Apple's about to come out with this iPad. Like, I have this idea for a news app. Would you want to, scroll through content from the same source? Would you want to swipe through content from the same source? And he would get feedback from people all day long. And he'd go home at night, because he didn't have any other classes. He'd go home at night and he'd work on the code based off the feedback, and he'd come back the next day and he'd get more feedback. And then he'd come back the next week with a little bit higher resolution prototype, and he'd get more feedback, come back the next week with a higher resolution prototype. Eventually, the device launched, and Akshay's company launched with the device. And now it was easy to get people to talk to him because they wanted to play with the iPad, right? Akshay is a very nice guy. He's as kind of sweet as he looks in this photograph. He went to this coffee shop so often and talked to so many people that the owners eventually banned him for life. They said, you can't come in here anymore, kid. You're bothering too many people. But by then, it was okay, because he already had his device, his company working on the device. Now, the company that Akshay started was called Pulse. And Pulse was one of the first news aggregator apps. You can see the design's pretty simple compared to what we have now, right? But people were learning how to use this device and how to navigate it when it first came out. And so this modular design really helped. And Pulse was immediately the #1 news aggregator app in the iTunes store. Now, I was still at the Washington Post at the time when Pulse launched. And I was actually in a digital executive meeting with our attorneys at the Post when our attorneys drafted a cease and desist letter to Akshay. They said, you're pulling too much content from the Washington Post. You're not allowed to take this much content. You have to stop. And the New York Times actually did the same thing. Their attorneys drafted a cease and desist letter to Akshay as well. And when I met Akshay a few years later at Stanford, he said, oh yeah, Justin, man, that was so great when you and the Times sent us those letters, because we took them with us when we went to raise money from venture capitalists. And the VC said, wow, if the Washington Post and New York Times are worried about this little company, we should invest in it, right? So he actually used it to his advantage because of how he was threatening us, which is its own lesson in how organizations often respond to innovation, right? You try to squash any competition that comes from innovation rather than looking at it as a trend or as a tailwind. What could we learn from Pulse that would help us at the Washington Post? But anyway, so Akshay raised money, started the company, hired people, ran the company for 3 years, and then after 3 years got acquired by LinkedIn for $90 million. So this was a really good outcome for Akshay. And he was immediately moved up pretty quickly after they put the Pulse algorithm into LinkedIn. Akshay was running LinkedIn for India, and then they put him in charge of LinkedIn Global. He was an executive, even though he's a very young guy, charge of LinkedIn for everywhere in the world except the United States, which has its own leader. And then eventually moved back to San Francisco. And now he started a new company called Notion, which is Some of you may use Notion, which is similar to Slack. It's kind of the next Slack in a way. So Akshay is doing really well, and now I get to call him and ask him to donate money back to the D School. So it's a good full circle sort of thing. But the thing I want to point out here is relating this back to creative confidence, right? If Akshay hadn't gotten out of the car, if he hadn't been willing to talk to strangers, right, he never would have started to develop his comfortability being uncomfortable, right? He never would have gone to the coffee shop day in, day out and engaged with strangers with his piece of cardboard with Post-it notes on it in order to learn more about how they might want to interact with his idea. And if he hadn't done that, he wouldn't have gotten early to market, right? Would not have gotten the letters from, you know, the Washington Post and the New York Times, would not have gotten another thing that happened, which was that Steve Jobs noticed Pulse early on and actually gave them a call out from the stage at the Apple Developers Conference. He said, hey, here's a new app that I really like. Akshay didn't know that was coming. That got them a lot of attention, right? And so it's not just about having new ideas or creative solutions to, you know, potential challenges that you're facing or that real people are facing. It's also how quickly can we get those ideas out of our heads and into the world so that we can learn as we go in order to get to the place that we're ready to launch something, right? Because being early to market with a new idea and bringing your idea to the organization is the way that it's going to create impact, right? So it's not just about embracing your creative confidence. It's how quickly can you get there? And how can you make it more about the people you're trying to serve than about whether or not they like your idea? Okay, so before we go to break, I just want to share, I have a quick video clip of Akshay when he came back to campus right after Pulse got acquired and gave a talk for our students. I think really illustrates sort of the roller coaster of being an entrepreneur.
But actually on the legal side, we did have a really fascinating day in June. I think we were still in school. So this was after the New York Times actually wrote about us, and that was more on the editorial side. And so, but I think this was Monday. I think it was sometime in June, early June. It was the WWDC conference, and Steve Jobs was going to actually release the iPhone 4. Which is a huge improvement. And then before he actually launched the iPhone 4, he talked about 5 or 6 apps that he loves. And we had no idea. Apple doesn't tell you anything until you actually see it. And so I was watching this in the dorm here, and Ankit was actually in New York. And so he's like, oh, let me show you some iPad apps that I like. And there we were. We were the first, you know, Pulse was the first app that he talked about. And I was just like, did that really happen? Am I dreaming here? But anyways, so this is like 10 a.m. Monday morning. I'm kind of going berserk. This is probably like the highest high. It's probably like the, you know, happiest I've ever been. Come like maybe 5 hours later, 3 o'clock, 3:30 to be precise, Ankit and I get an email from Apple saying that, you know, New York Times has complained and we've taken your app out of the store 5 hours later. So when they talk about roller coaster, you know, the entrepreneur's life being a roller coaster, that happened in 5 hours. I think a lot of things that happened, and then we were back into the store the next day morning. But that was one of the craziest Mondays I've ever had. We've ever had.
So talk about navigating ambiguity, right? All that happened in one day for them. Okay, so thank you so much for your presence so far this afternoon there, and for all your work and engagement. We're going to take about a 15-minute break now. Okay, so let's just make it 18 minutes, and then we come back at 1/4 the hour. Okay, and when we come back, we're going to now dig into the tools of design thinking. All right, so we're going to go deeper into empathy and the define stages, and we'll have more activities as well, and get to a landing point at the end of the day today that we'll pick up with again tomorrow. Okay, so let's take a break. If you have questions when we come back, I'll open with answering questions from anything we talked about so far. Any thoughts on what you've heard so far, or questions that have come up, or anything you want to share? No, good. Yes, Alex. Hi.
I have a question. So my organization, on the one hand, we're trying to be innovative. We're a disruptive new organization. At the same time, we're in that horrible startup phase where everyone's trying to do too much and everyone is totally overwhelmed. So I'm really wrestling with this. How do we stay creative and disruptive?
Yeah.
At the same time as getting a manageable workload, because people can do it for a while, but they can't keep doing it. And I just had a bit of in the last exercise with the targets, I sort of thought, what we've been trying to do is prioritize this workload, and it's really not working. Because all we're really doing is shuffling. So I don't know if you have any tips on that. Like, how do we keep this creative, disruptive thing going without completely overloading people? Because there are loads of practical stuff we have to do. We're in regulation.
Sure.
There's lots of stuff that has to get done.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. And I think we all feel that from time to time, but never more so than when you're trying to build something new, right? Like in a startup. I think one thing that can be useful is just elevating those feelings and making it okay for people to talk about how overwhelmed they feel, sort of letting it out in a way so that then they can dive back in. I mean, obviously prioritizing time and things like that too, but I think the opportunity to express how we're feeling, not just what we're doing, makes a difference. And the reason why I think I bring that up now is because that same framework from that ambiguity exercise, the self, the team, and the project. So I call that the I, the we, and the it, right? And I use that all the time in organization design, because the way I think about it is the work that we're doing, what we're working on, gets most of the attention and conversation, right? But no matter what we're working on, there's a way of working that we're doing it together, and that is the we. How are we working together, right? And we do a lot of reflection, team reflection on, here's how I feel about working with you, and how that working with you affects the outcome of what we're working on, affects the it, right? And same down at the I, here's what I'm feeling, right? And so all of those things are happening below the surface, even while we're working on the project. It's just we don't talk about them as much because they're more emotional, they're more personal, right? But recognizing that those emotional and personal impact the outcome then can help sort of incentivize those conversations, because like, we don't talk about it, we're not going to do as good work, right? So I use that again, like as the rational language as the wedge, right? So hey, if what we're working on is affected by how we work together and how I feel, how we each individually feel about working together, let's have a conversation about how you're feeling, right? And then it gives everyone a chance to say, oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or my kids wouldn't walk home in the rain from school, right? Like the example we just had, like being able to say those things not only helps us understand each other better, because we do have common experiences about what's affecting us personally, but it helps us sort of get it out, and then being able to bring our whole selves to the work that we're doing together, right? So I think that would be a good place to start. Like, how do you help encourage those conversations? We had for a long time at the D School a gentleman called the D Shrink, and his name is Julian Gorodsky, and he's this amazing psychologist and therapist here. And the way that he came to work at the D School it predated me. It was David Kelly and the other professors, when they were trying to build this D School, which was, again, not something that had been done before, so nobody really knew. They were arguing a lot, like collaboration amongst professors is usually around a grant, and give me my money and I'll go work on my own thing. The professors don't work together a lot, and typically. And so there was a lot of argument. And so one day David brought his shrink to the meeting, because his theory was that if there's a shrink in the room, everyone's on their best behavior because they don't want to be called out. And Julian stuck around, and he developed a lot of our team reflection tools. Right? How do we elevate these things? And one of those tools, which I'll send you a worksheet later to all of you, which is, it's just a simple language thing. It's I like, I wish, I wonder. Here's what I like about our work together. Here's what I wish were different. Here's what I wonder what we might do about it. It's all positive language, right? It's not I like, I hate, or But you could say, you know, what I like is how much we're accomplishing in a short amount of time. What I wish is that it didn't take such a toll on my personal life and physical well-being. You know, I wonder if, right. And so again, it's just like giving people the mechanism to have those personal conversations could be an interesting place to start.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. Yeah. Jillian has a question. So I've talked a lot about communication and dialogue. What about reflection when we're working virtually? I think it's a similar approach. Thanks for that question. I think it's a similar approach. I think it's just requires a little bit more intention, right? So setting the environment that, you know, because there's less serendipitous conversation happening, and because Zoom meetings or Teams meetings or whatever it is you're using your virtual platforms are more by appointment, right? Like, oh, we have this hour to talk about this. You have to be intentional about saying the first 10 minutes is going to be about this, right? Or we're going to set an hour to talk about the mental toll that our work is taking on us, or, you know, and don't show up if it's too much of a mental toil, right? It's a little bit, it's a little tricky, but you know, that's why I play music, you know, and we always play music when we're doing workshops in person, but there's all kinds of ways to, you know, to affect mood and things. Not that I'm trying to manipulate you all, but you know what I mean? And so it just requires more intention. Well, we've done a lot of things at the D School because we're in a learning environment. You know, we can have a lot of fun with it because we're not, there's no P&L. So, you know, some of my colleagues have developed avatars that participants in workshops, then there's a simple algorithm you drop your picture into and it makes a bitmap like image of yourself, and then everyone has that. Or backgrounds are fun, or, you know, like whatever you can use to try to evoke a behavior, right? That's what we try to do. And yeah, the conversation templates can be helpful online too. And so yeah, I'll think more about that too, more specific examples. Thanks for that. Other questions or thoughts on your mind right now? Yes, Natasha.
Thank you. I just wanted to share one of the tools that we created, or I created in my organization. It's called Culture Cards.
Mm-hmm.
We launched the new core behaviors at London Fire Brigade, and I was thinking about some creative ways to actually really help people engage with these behaviors. And this is basically a pack of cards with lots of quotes, questions, and discussion topics, which people can use in meetings. And what we do, we just spread the cards on the table or on the floor, and we pick the cards and we talk about them. And the questions I usually use, and they are in the booklet, also included in the box. They are: what made you pick that card? Why do you think it's important? How do you feel if it's present, this behavior is present? Or how do you feel if it's not present? And this is really a key, always a key question, most important question. And dynamics in the room changes after that question, because in that moment we start talking about feelings, and that actually starts a really, really good conversation.
Yeah.
So people can pick what they want to talk about, and they just can express themselves. So they don't need to say, it's really important for me, but they can always say, oh, the card says this. It wasn't me who said it. So it's a kind of a prompt, which also works really well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I would say, I mean, prompt is a great word too. And I always say wedge. I think of it as wedge for some reason, but in that case, the cards are the excuse to have the conversation, right? And you know, it's the same kind of thing. Like I use language initially as the excuse to have the conversation, or we agree on this, and now we're going to try something. And
yeah, but I really like what you suggested. I'm going to borrow it from you if you don't mind. When you said what I like about, how did you say it? What I like about.
I wish, I wonder. Yeah,
I like I wish, I wonder. It's wonderful. It's wonderful because it's so easy to fall into kind of blaming.
Yeah.
And you know, negative side of. Thank
totally.
you.
Yeah, that's something Julian taught me. Yeah. The other thing it makes me think of the example is, you know, we talked, you heard David in the video, David Kelly talk about Albert Bandura. So Albert Bandura is a behavioral psychologist, professor at Stanford, and he's been around a long time. I think he's in his 80s now. And what we learned from his research at a just very simple level is this theory of guided mastery. Okay, and guided mastery is that, you know, behavior change is more difficult in a giant leap than it is in a series of small successes, right? So if you have a giant leap that you want the organization to take, or that you want an individual to take, this is where you want them to end up. Rather than pushing them to that immediately, which is much more difficult, how do you break it down into a series of small successes so that the behavior grows over time, right? And Bandura's guided mastery theory comes from his work with people who have phobias of snakes. Okay, so if you have a phobia of a snake, and you know they bring you into a room and put a snake on your shoulders, that would be a giant leap, right? That would be unhealthy for you. And so what Bandura did was he brought people with phobias of snakes into a room adjacent to a room with a snake in it, right? And first they have to get comfortable with that idea. There's a snake in the room next door. Then he brought a chair into the room, said, now you're going to sit down in this chair. Okay, so as soon as you're comfortable being uncomfortable, you get a little bit more uncomfortable, right? You sit down in the chair, it's harder to run away. Now we're going to move the chair closer to the door between the rooms. Comfortable with that? We're going to move it closer. Comfortable with that? We're going to move it closer. Comfortable with that? Now you have your hand on the door between the rooms. Comfortable with that? Now you're moving into the room with the snake. And eventually they have the snake on their shoulders. So it's in these series of small successes, each time they get comfortable, you push to be a little bit more uncomfortable, right? That they start to build the muscles, you know, the behaviors that allow them to adapt to this change that's happening. Okay, so it's the same thing, it's same way I try to teach, right? If I can start off with draw your neighbor activity and get you to draw a picture of each other, right? And there's a lesson behind it, there's a reason, so you don't feel like I'm just making you, you know, asking you to do things that don't have a reason behind them, right? Then we can start to apply that creative self-efficacy to challenges that you're actually working on. Then we can start to share, you know, together how we dealt with ambiguity in our lives. Then we, right? So we start to build, right? So that is the benevolent manipulation, I hope, that you're going through right now in this workshop. So this is how we teach. How do we build these behaviors through a series of small successes? Same thing in the organization, right? So to Natasha's point, if you start bringing out cards, you know, and you're working with mechanical engineers, they may be like, that's too far. That's like I'm in the room with the snake. That feels too squishy to me, right? So how do you start to get them to talk about their emotion? What's the pre-step before the cards, you know? And so thinking of it in that way and building toward the behavior change rather than trying to leap toward it comes from guided mastery, if you're interested in that. Okay, so we're going to dive back in, and let me get back to the slides here. And we're about to get a whole lot more into the mechanics of this design thinking framework and the tools that are associated with it. So if you have experienced design thinking in an article or another workshop or something like that, you've likely seen these hexagons. This is something that the D School put out at the very beginning, about 15 or so years ago. It's very helpful for design thinking for business, right? For creating new products and services and experiences. It's less helpful in social challenges or systems level challenges. But I think of it as essentially the notes, right? So I used to take piano lessons when I was a kid, and one thing I learned is that you have to learn the notes before you can compose your own song, right? And so I think of this as sort of learning the notes, and then as you learn the notes, then you can put them together in different ways and apply them in different ways. And that's what people have done. That's why design thinking has spread the way that it has. So we're going to dive into this. One thing I want you to think about is that even zooming out from these 5 different sort of phases, if you will, the empathize and define phases are really about problem finding, right? So you have a challenge that you're working on. Here's the thing that is important to us. And now we're going to think about who are the people who are affected by it, and how do we prioritize the people across that ecosystem? And now how do we empathize with the ones that we're prioritizing? So how do we try to learn about this thing that we're taking on from their perspective? What is their current behavior around it? How do they feel about it? What do they think? What do they do? What are their actions and behaviors, right? So that's the empathy piece. As we learn as best we can, now we synthesize what we learn, and we now incorporate their perspective, the people we're creating something for, back into how we're framing the problem. And we call that the define stage. Okay, so now we get to a new problem frame before we then start to creatively solve that problem. So rather than just taking, here's the challenge we're working on, who has a great idea? let's start to solve it, we're going to engage with the people who are affected and then incorporate their point of view into it. And in many cases, bring them into the process as well, especially if it's a social impact type challenge or an internal organizational challenge. So it's problem finding, problem solving. And today we're going to focus on problem finding. Tomorrow we're going to get into problem solving. Now, when we're doing this, we are both converging and diverging as we go, or what we would call focusing and flaring. Okay, so when we are interviewing people and engaging with them, we're starting with questions that we have, but we're allowing them to take it where they go because it's more about them than it is about us, right? So a lot of our follow-up questions come from their answers. It's not a survey to get everything answered. So we're diverging. You know, here's the thing we're starting with. Now we're diverging by learning from them. Now we're getting back to a tight problem statement that's focusing. Now we're flaring, we're diverging when we're trying to come up with as many possible solutions as we can. Now, as we choose one to prototype to learn more or multiple ones to prototype, now we're focusing again. And so we do this back and forth. With design thinking, we're separating when we're converging from when we're diverging. We're not trying to do them both at the same time, because if we do, we're not really making maximum use of each mindset, right? You've probably experienced this, happens pretty commonly in brainstorming, which should be like part of the ideation phase for us, the orange one. You know, if you're brainstorming, a lot of people are throwing out great ideas, and then someone, you know, in the back of the room maybe says, well, let me just play devil's advocate for a minute, or how much would that cost, right? As soon as you start evaluating ideas, it shuts down the generation of ideas, right? And so as soon as you start to focus within that flaring phase, you stop flaring. And it's not that we think that every idea we come up with is going to be brilliant, but it is that we think that the best way to get a brilliant idea is to get a lot of ideas. So we want to generate as many ideas as we can. So we separate the, you know, judgment of ideas from the generating of ideas, right? So we focus or flare independently, knowing that there's this back and forth sort of double diamond approach. Okay, so first thing I want you to do here is I want you to think about a project that you're working on right now. What is something that you're doing right now, preferably with other people in your organization? So let's focus on a business challenge, an organizational challenge. And is this thing you're working on, is it a new product that you're trying to bring to bear? Is it a service that you're starting, you know, a new training or a compliance issue or something like that? Or is it a system that you're working on? Maybe there's a new platform that's being implemented for internal comms or something like that. So what is something you're currently working on? Is it a product? Is it a service? Or is it a system? Okay, and we're going to put you into breakout rooms. Katie's going to set you up in just a second. And I want you to just talk to another person about this thing you're working on. And as you talk about it, I want you to just jot it down. I'm working on this. It's a system. It's a service. Okay. All right. I'm going to give you about 6 minutes in the breakouts. Take 3 minutes each. So let one person go first. I'll send you a note when the 3 minutes is up for you to switch roles, and then the other person will share what they're working on. Okay. The reason why we're doing this is because as soon as we get back, I'm going to talk to you about problem framing, and I'm going to give you an example and a way to apply it. And I'm going to see if, after talking about problem framing, if you can revisit the thing that you're working on and maybe think of it slightly differently. So we're trying to learn and apply in real time. I don't know what project you're going to choose right now, so we'll see how it goes. But I think it'll go well because I've done this before. All right. So put you in a breakout room. What's something you're currently working on? We'll see you back here in 6 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Sorry, no one came back early that time, which tells me that you were very engaged in your conversations and probably wanted more time. So apologies for that. I hope you each got a chance to share, though. Did you each get a chance to share what you're working on? Okay, good. All right. So one thing I want to say too, just about feedback also is I love how everyone's been participating in the chat, so many of you, and also folks for speaking up. And one thing to remember about that kind of participation, if you feel sort of shy or humble about it, is when you start to talk about a particular application or a question that you have for yourself, it also is helping everyone else, right? Because the more we hear real examples, the more other people see, oh, that's the same thing I have in my situation, or here's, oh, that's an interesting analogy to what I'm doing. So you are teaching in a way as well through your participation. So appreciate that from each of you, and also how you engage with each other in these breakouts. So you all have something you're working on, you jotted down, whether it's a product or service or a system. I want to talk to you now for a few minutes about problem framing. This is actually, I would say, the most useful tool that I learned when I first came out to Stanford. And what it basically is about is that oftentimes the way we frame the challenges that we're working on determine where we end up on those challenges, right? And there's a vulnerability to framing the challenges that we're working on around what we've always done, right? Anytime you have expertise in a particular area or years of experience in that area, we tend to frame the challenges we're trying to solve around what we've already done, right? And that's fine if what we're after is a core improvement, an incremental one, but it can also inhibit us from thinking about what we might do and helping us evolve. So a quick example from me, you know, I as I mentioned, worked at the Washington Post before I came here. And one year at the Washington Post, I got to redesign the newspaper. Okay, so I come from a newspaper design background, and this was a great opportunity for me to redesign this iconic brand, look at the, you know, fonts and the readability of our body type, and create new headline hierarchy to tell more of the story in a headline, and create new destinations for photos and graphics and things like that, right? And I was very proud of the work that I did on this team that was redesigning the newspaper. It was a 10-month project, and at the end of 10 months, guess what we ended up with? A newspaper, right? Because what we set out to do was to redesign the newspaper. So because the solution was built into the challenge, we ended up with an incrementally better version of what already existed, an incrementally better newspaper. I thought it was a lot better newspaper, but you know, it's incremental probably in our readers' eyes. Okay, so that's fine if creating an incrementally better newspaper was actually going to help us with the declining business model of newspapers, but it really wasn't, right? Because the future is technology. So if we had taken a step back and we had said, what is the newspaper for? What is the purpose of the newspaper? At that time, this is before Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. So at that time, it was very focused on our local audience. You know, it just happens to be the local audience also has international implications in DC, right? So what if we had said the newspaper is to connect people locally where we distribute it with the issues that they care about? Newspapers connect people and inform people locally with the issues that they care about. Now let's go out and interview people. Let's empathize. Let's take a design thinking approach. Let's go talk to people about what local means to them. What issues do you care about, right? At that time, we might have come to an insight that in the digital age, for better or worse, local is increasingly less about your neighbor and more about your network, right? I don't know if that's a good thing, but it's less about the person who lives next door and more about the people that you want to converse with and be influenced by and influence yourselves. If we had come to that insight, then we might have designed Facebook, right? How do we connect people locally with the issues they care about when local is more about your network than your neighbor? If we had designed Facebook, we wouldn't have been in dire financial straits, right? So even if we hadn't gotten to that insight, we might not have been constrained to produce a newspaper. We might have created something else. We might have realized newspaper is just the distribution of this information. It's the information that is the public service, right? So that was a big epiphany for me. I was like, hey, it's not that the disruptors at that time in Silicon Valley are smarter than us necessarily, or even that they have different skills necessarily, because we had coders and developers too. It's that they're asking questions in different ways. They're not constrained by the perspective that we constrain ourselves by. And because we constrain ourselves, we can change it, right? So at the D School, we call this problem framing. And I'm going to give you an example now from one of our student projects. And then I'm going to ask you to revisit the thing that you're working on and see if you can immediately apply this principle, this tool. So we teach a lot of classes at the D School, more than 70 classes a year now. And it's design thinking applied to all kinds of different domains. So I teach organization design. We go inside of real organizations and interview people and take on challenges like how might we hire for emotional intelligence and not just skill ability? How do non-co-located teams build trust quickly? Like all of those kinds of things. One of our classes is much more external. It's called Design for Extreme Affordability. And this is one of our flagship courses. It's been around since the beginning of the D School. In this class, our students are partnered with nonprofits and NGOs in the developing world. And they are given usually a design challenge to create a physical product solution that helps people with a particular challenge that they face in that part of the world. Now, in this class, our students, they apply from all across campus. And so they come from all these different programs. They don't know each other before they're in the class, and they're put into these small, usually 5-person multidisciplinary teams to take on the project that they're assigned. One year, the students were assigned a project partner was a hospital in Nepal where infant mortality rates are really high. And more babies die immediately after childbirth in that part of the world, in Nepal, right on the edge of India, than just about anywhere else. And the challenge the students were given was to design a lower cost baby incubator for the hospital, with the thought being that if they could change the form function and lower the cost because they're so expensive, then the hospital could afford more incubators and buy more and therefore save more babies' lives. Right? So in this class, as in all of our classes, the students travel and do their field work. They do empathy work with people who are affected by the challenge. And so it's a special class that has a budget attached to it. It bridges our spring break so they can go to the countries when they don't have other classes. And this is a picture that one of the students took in the hospital room in Nepal where the incubators are kept. And as they were walking around asking questions, we teach them to ask why a lot. Why is this the case? They noticed that the incubators were empty. And so one of the students said, hey, why are the incubators empty? All right, there are no babies here right now. Are we here at an odd time? Like, you know, is this unusual? And the doctor said, actually, it's a little bit unusual, but not all that unusual. Sometimes there are no babies here. And in fact, the babies that are most vulnerable never make it to the hospital because the hospital's in town, in the city, and the babies that are most vulnerable are born in rural villages in the countryside. And in fact, they're born prematurely. And so their mothers can't get them here in time to get the care that they need. So now faced with this information, the students had a choice. Before they made a choice, they said, well, let's go investigate this. Let's try to see if this is true and see what we can learn about this. So they hopped on a bus and they made their way to the end of the bus route. And then they walked about an hour from there to get to a village. And then they started walking around the village. And sure enough, they met people who confirmed what the doctor had said, that babies in their village had died because they couldn't get to the hospital in time. So now the students said, should we stick with the problem we were given by our professors? We want to get a good grade in the class. It's just an elective, right? You know, we're here for other reasons, other degrees that we're getting for our careers. Should we stick with the problem we're given the class and design a lower cost incubator for the hospital? We want to help the people at the hospital. We like them. Or should we go after this other challenge, right? Should we reframe the problem and focus more on the babies from the villages? So I have this 2-minute video clip now of the students talking about how they wrestled with this. And you're going to hear them mention one of the tools of design thinking called the point of view statement, or the POV. What the POV is it is your sort of problem reframe. So you have a problem you're trying to solve. Now you engage with the people who are affected by it. You prioritize which group of people you want to design for, either where the biggest need is or however you prioritize it. Some strategy comes in there. And then you incorporate their perspective back into the problem reframe, which we call the point of view statement, or POV. Okay, so I want you to listen to how the students wrestled with this new information, and then I'll tell you what they ended up doing.
Coming up with this point of view is the next big thing, you know, where you kind of figure out who your user is and what their need is. And that's probably the place where you have to spend the most amount of time ever, because that pretty much sets the trend for what happens later on.
We had to decide where we're going to design for. Are we going to design for the extreme remote areas? Are we going to design for something in between? So on the one hand, there's a clear need here for something that will work in rural areas. On the other hand, there's the engineer in me telling me, dude, that's going to be hard. We had mixed opinions on this, right? Some people on the team wanted to do the more remote setting. Others wanted to do something, and I was one of the others who was caught in two minds. Should we actually be doing something more tractable, right? that can actually be done by the end of the class. We are stuck here, and finally we get one of the TAs in this class. We presented her with what we are facing, and she said, you know, this, given a choice, I'd say go after the hard challenge. See, this is what puts the extreme in extreme affordability. Okay. I said, okay, fine. We'll try. We'll see what we can do with the more rural setting. And so our POV became what it is.
Our point of view, the user is a desperate parent living in a remote village who needs the means to give her dying baby a chance to survive. So that's how we reframe the problem. It's no longer about the clinician, but about the parent.
We've also taken a step back from incubators, and we're saying that we're trying to give these babies a chance to survive.
That's where we define the problem, and that's where we said, all right, we're going to try to do something, and we always, for this user and for this need, and we always we posted it on our sort of our whiteboard, and we'll always go back and say, okay, are we still addressing this point of view? You know, after every time we come up with a prototype and every time we do an iteration or something like that, are we still focusing, you know, are we still making sure that we're reaching this user and meeting their needs?
Okay. So I love Rahul. Dude, that's going to be hard. Like, shouldn't we do something we can finish by the end of the class? But they didn't. They decided to go after the harder challenge. They reframed the problem to be about helping the mother in the village. And when they got to the end of the class, they had a prototype that they liked. They got a good grade in the class, which was important to them. And then something remarkable happened, which was that instead of just going back to whatever career aspirations they had that brought them to graduate school, they realized they were onto something that could save babies' lives. And so they stayed together and they kept working on this idea. And ultimately what they created was this. So it's called the Embrace Infant Warmer, and it's over there on the left of this picture. And it looks like a sleeping bag for a baby. It's like a tiny little bag. And in their testing with mothers said that they want to be able to see that their baby is breathing while they're trying to get to the hospital. And so there's a window there, so you can see the child's chest go up and down. And the bigger incremental innovation is in the lower right. That white stuff is a wax, a candle wax-like material, which is a phase shift material. So all you have to do is be able to boil water in the village, and the wax gets hot, turns to a liquid, and you slide the package into the back of the sleeping bag. The plastic that holds the wax has a high melting point, so it doesn't melt. You slide it into the back of the sleeping bag, and it keeps the whole bag warm for about 4 hours, which is enough time to get the baby to the hospital. So in the years since these students started this little sleeping bag now has helped save the lives of more than 300,000 babies around the world. And it is deployed in 22 different countries. The bags themselves are too expensive for people in the villages to afford them. So they're a nonprofit, and they raise money and they manufacture the bags, and the bags are then put in the villages so that they're there when people need them. And they've won all kinds of awards for this. I used to have this in here last year because I wanted people to remind people who aren't in the United States that the country will be different again. It changes every election. Sorry, that's my California bias. But one of the reasons why we talk about this project is not just because of the inspiring outcome, but also because of the learning around problem framing. Okay, so when we approach innovation as a creative problem solving approach, we're almost always then focused on the incremental improvement of things that already exist. If the students had stuck with the challenge they were given, design a lower cost incubator for a hospital, they probably would have come up with a pretty interesting outcome, changed the form function, and have designed a lower cost incubator for the hospital because the solution was built into how the problem was being framed, right? That would be a creative problem solving approach that would lead to incremental innovation. With design thinking, we're focused first on creative problem finding. Here's the thing we're trying to do. Now, how do we go engage with people in order to incorporate their perspective? Now we're getting to a problem frame that is closer to something that's meaningful for the people who are going to use the product or service or system, right? And now we might create a problem solve around that initial idea. And you can see in this case that the students use both mindsets, right? They found a problem no one else was trying to solve. They pursued that. They got to, hey, how about an infant warmer as a way to get the baby to the hospital? Now we need to make sure that the infant warmer stays warm for 4 hours, that the baby arrives in the condition they need to be with a steady temperature to receive more advanced care. So let's come up with a phase shift material. That's a problem solving approach, right? So one of these is not better than the other. It's just over and over again, when I meet people who have experience and expertise in their area, we are all just more vulnerable to frame problems around what we've always done, to design a better newspaper, right? Rather than thinking about what is the problem that resonates with the people we're designing for. So simple framing is this: the way we frame the problem often determines what we create. If we're focused on incremental innovation, then we want to frame the problem around the solution. Let's make a better version of the thing we already do. But when we're working towards something transformational, something new, let's frame it around the behavior we're trying to encourage, right? You notice they said, how might we keep the baby warm from village to hospital, right? The solution's not baked into that frame. The solution was the infant warmer, right? But it's not, how do we design a sleeping bag, okay? So frame around the behavior you're trying to encourage, helping a mother get her baby to the hospital in this case. Then ask yourself, well, whose behavior? And that's usually a good place to start your empathy work. Oh, it's the mother. Oh, it's the local reader, okay? So very simple semantic tool. And that's what I want you to consider now, okay? And remember, as you consider this, whatever you wrote down can have an outsized impact on where you end up, okay? So I asked you to consider something you're working on as a product or service or a system, which is a little bit of a trick, right? But if you're thinking of it as a product, it's probably going to end up being a product, no matter what you learn during the process. If you're thinking of it as a service, it's probably going to end up being a service, no matter what you learn, because when we slip into default mode, it takes a great deal of agility to override this state, okay? So if you want to consider possibilities, don't bake the solution into how you're framing the problem. And one way to do that is to frame it around the behavior instead. So I want you to go back to the project that you thought of before, and I want you to ask yourself these questions. How might you reframe this? What behavior am I trying to encourage with this project? And then whose behavior? And that's usually who you're prioritizing as the person who's going to use this thing. Okay? Now what I'd like to do, if we can, Katie, is can we put them back into the same breakouts? Okay, good. So you already know what your partner is working on, and they already know what you're working on. And I just want you to have a short discussion together about, is there anything from this problem framing lesson that you can immediately apply that might help you approach this challenge a little bit differently? Okay, so we'll just take about 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a discussion with whoever wants to share about how they're thinking about it, okay? Anybody have any immediate application? Did this reframe examples that we just talked about, did it give you any different way of thinking about something that you're currently working on that you're willing to share with the rest of us?
Justin, it's Tim.
Hey, Tim.
I was with Bhavika, and actually we were glad of the reframe because we're both working on culture change for our organizations. Yes. And so great. The framing of, is it a product, is it a service, is it a system? Actually, I was struggling with that, to say, well, it's not really any of those. It's actually about behaviors. So
yes, good.
Actually, the reframe, I think, has helped us both, but left us, Bhavika, with the question in particular around whose behavior, because that, you know, especially when you're talking about culture, whose behavior you're trying to influence, and that's got multiple dimensions to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you know, in these examples that I'm sharing too, they're simplified, obviously, right? Like we're talking about one specific person here, the desperate mother, right? But as they got into the project, it's more complicated. It didn't, they didn't come up with the infant warmer the next week, right? This was, multiple years, right? And so to me, it's, by learning the tool, then you can apply it. But oftentimes when we're designing in an ecosystem or a system, like you're talking about, it's who are the different people within the system, employee at this level, manager, supervisor, whatever it is, right? And you may be designing for all of them, but the way that we use design thinking to its sort of fullest potential is, instead of designing for all of them at once, which then might be sort of a consensus model, right? Which my definition of a consensus approach is that it's going to be mediocre, right? Because we're trying to meet in the middle. Meeting in the middle is mediocre, right? So how do you design specifically for the different people in the system and take that through to its conclusion and then make decisions, right? About where are we prioritizing, or how is it communicated, or how can it be personalized, or how can, you know, and so that we get to unique solutions for unique people, right? That's not sort of this consensus driven approach. And I think that's really hard in organizational systems. Like Jillian, we were just talking about performance reviews, right? And how do we redesign performance reviews? So that's a great example to say, what is the performance review for, right? So that we're not just incrementally improving the performance review system that already exists. What is it for? How do we encourage that behavior? It's not for an annual conversation about how you're doing. It's actually meant to help people improve in their work over the course of the year, right? So how do we reframe it around the behavior? Anyway, Tim, thank you for that. That's great. Other thoughts on this conversation that you just had?
Justin, a quick question for me. I mean,
yeah, Def.
When we are trying to reframe, how do you deal, and I'm hoping that we will pick this up through either this session or future sessions, how do you deal with those people who are reluctant or who are finding it difficult to actually take that step back and try and look at it from a different perspective, from a different point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the way you ask the question in the room, or if you're having a conversation with one other person. I think tone plays a lot in it. But for me, Dev, it's just like, hey, what is this thing for? But it's not like, hey, what is this for? And then you sound like insubordinate or something, you know? So it's kind of like, hey, what is the purpose? What do you think the purpose does this? You know, when this was implemented in our company, things were different. You know, we were all working together in person, and this is pre-pandemic. So now given the new normal, how do we think this adapts? Or if we were to create this system or form anew, what would we do differently? You know,
yeah.
Sometimes like at the executive or organizational level, we'll say, if you were to start your company from scratch today, how would you disrupt yourselves, right? And then just frees you in that construct to like release the baggage that already exists that, you know, says, well, we can't do that because of this, right? And then allows you to, you know, go into things with different mindset.
But I guess the challenge is that what if you're in a constant firefighting mode, and lots of challenges, and there just isn't that time, or people feel there isn't just that time to, you know, we need to look at it differently. We just want to deliver this. It needs to get delivered. Doesn't matter what happens elsewhere, and you know you're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But how do you just say, let's take a step back?
So yeah, I mean, a couple of ways I think about that. One is so I really call it, so anytime you're trying to change behavior, remember that you're working against the status quo. You're working against inertia. It's not always that people are, you know, not creative or reluctant or mean or whatever. It's actually normal to continue doing what we've always done, right? Yeah. So they're behaving, the critics are behaving normally. You're the one who's being abnormal by asking people to change. So you're working against all of those different forces that are keeping people in the current way of working. And so I think that creating room for that change the phrase I use is benevolent manipulation. You're manipulating people, but for the greater good, right? Sure. And so, you know, one way to, and that's why I call it a wedge. And one way to create that is, you know, whatever opportunity you have to start to incentivize new behaviors, you use in a way, if people will, you know, the guided mastery piece, if it will resonate with them. So for example, anytime you're in a training like this, if someone else at your organization knows you're in the training, you have an opportunity to tell them about what you learned, right? People feel comfortable or safe with brands, right? So you could say, hey, this guy from Stanford told us about this. You've heard of Stanford. They've done some pretty good things in the world. Maybe we should try this next thing, right? If it's like draw your neighbor, and that's like a little bit too squishy or too touchy-feely in your environment, you say, well, remember, this guy's from California and he's an American, so he's just much more comfortable with those silly things, right? Or whatever, right? So you can both use it to create room and disavow it to protect yourself, right? And so that becomes the way. Any training becomes that. What did you learn at the training, right? Another thing to think about, sorry, you just got me going. Another thing to think about is what are the cultural levers within your organization? So quick story, in our executive programs, when we used to do them on campus pre-pandemic, people would come from all different companies and then go back and do things. And then we'd stay in touch with them, and people who went through the program then become coaches in the program. So they come back and share what they learned. And one year there was a woman who was about to talk to the whole group who'd been in a previous cohort. She was going to share her experience. And so I was talking to her on the side, as I hadn't met her before. And I said, what company are you with? And she said, oh, I'm with the fruit company. And I said, oh, the fruit company, like, in California, we have a lot of produce. I was like, which fruit company? And she said, oh, Apple, right? So she meant Apple computers. And she's like, yeah, it's just a joke, like we call it the fruit company. And I said, oh, interesting. So what are you going to share? And she said, well, actually, like, that little anecdote is kind of indicative of our culture, because we're a very secretive company, right? We don't share things that people don't need to know. We only share, what we need to share at the time we need to share. In fact, the culture at Apple is, when you work there, you have your badge, your employee ID. Your employee ID only gives you access to parts of the buildings that you should have access to. You can't go anywhere you want at the company, almost like the Pentagon, where you can only go through certain doors and everything. And so the story that she shared about how she built momentum for design thinking at Apple was that when she first got back, she booked one of the main conference rooms on the public internal booking site for what she called a secret workshop, right? So people didn't know what the workshop was about, but they wanted to know, because internal information is internal currency at Apple, right? And so people signed up for the secret workshop, filled up the room, right? Happened so fast that other people couldn't get into the workshop because it was already full. And in fact, somebody else booked a competing conference room at the same time for their own workshop, because they were like, well, I can't go to your secret workshop, I'm gonna run my own workshop over here. But they didn't even know what they were missing, right? So she took a behavior that's part of their culture and leveraged it to bring in something different, right? And so now people who got into the workshop felt lucky to be there, even though they didn't know what they were doing until they got into the room. So they were more likely to participate, right? Because they had this opt-in, culture. And then two, when they came out, people wanted to know what it was about. So it created this information opportunity. So just a beautiful way to think about what are the levers that exist in your organization, and how can you manipulate those levers in order to create room for people to want to do something new.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah,
thanks. You just reminded me of that story. Thank you. Okay, Pratik, yes.
Hi, just a quick question. As you think about reframing problems, any thoughts on the how far out you go, or the bound of where you could frame the problem? Because taken to the extreme, you end up with customers and shareholders very quickly, which can be a very abstract thing for large percentage of the organization.
Yes.
So any experiences in how you think about the right framing, the right boundaries as part of reframing?
I think it has to do with your individual and team access point, right? So for example, if these students had kept going out and going out and going out, they're further and further disconnected from something they could actually do, right? Which is go interview the people in the village. In fact, while you were in the breakout room, we were talking about this a little bit, right? There are other issues that come up within this example. Like, why are the babies being born prematurely? What's going on with the nourishment of people in the villages? Why does it take them so long to get to the hospital? There's a transportation approach to a solution here. Why did the physician know they're the most vulnerable but not doing anything? Why aren't there clinics in the villages, right? So that goes back to sort of that Venn diagram at the beginning, which is the feasibility question. What's feasible for us? And so what I was saying while you were in the breakout is, one of the mantras that I remember is do what you can with what you have where you are, which is really about your access to impact, right? So these students, the design school is linked to product design at Stanford. We're in the same building. we're within mechanical engineering. So they start thinking, what's a product that we could create? Sleeping bag, right? So the further out you go, you have to be careful not to get so far away that you don't have access to impact anymore, right? I have a colleague, actually our academic director, Bernie Roth, he's been teaching at Stanford for more than 50 years, came here in the 60s. And he does this whole workshop around asking why. Every time you say, here's the thing that I want to achieve in my life. What would this do for me? Why is this important? Oh, it would make me feel this way. Oh, then let's focus on it from what else might make you feel this way. So you're expanding your opportunities, right? Rather than thinking, I have to do this. He always does it with students about getting married. He's like, if you want to get married, what would it do for you to be married? Oh, it would provide companionship or whatever, right? Just to keep everything on the up. He said, well, how else can you have companionship? Oh, there's other ways, right? So you're starting to get to, and it's like, well, why is companionship important? Oh, because I don't want to feel alone. Why do you feel alone? So, but he always cautions, the more you ask why, the more you get to the universal questions, which is, why are we here? What is this about? And that is harder to achieve impact, right? Unless you want to stop what you're doing and become a philosopher, which doesn't pay very well. So anyway, there's other issues. So yes, very good point. Got to keep it in the level of where you can impact the situation.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to jump back in. There's a little bit more I want to get to in our last sort of half hour today, and then we're going to pick up tomorrow. But I love how you're thinking about reframing and viewing that as it's a very simple tool, right? To be able to ask, what is this for and who? And what are the behaviors that we're trying to encourage? And as we start to ask that, now we start to get into, well, who do we want to engage with to learn more about their current behaviors before we start to try to create solutions for their future behaviors, right? How do we incorporate the people who we're creating for into the process of what we create? And we do that by empathizing, okay? So just conversationally here, a question for you all. What do we mean by empathy? What is empathy? Anybody have a general definition of empathy that you like?
Understanding someone's view.
Yeah, Dev, thanks. Yeah, trying to understand someone's view as best you can, right? Yeah, I mean, this is the definition that we use. It's you can think through the experience of another person by understanding it as best as you can. I think it's important to use, like you said, Dev, trying or as best as you can, because we can never completely understand someone else's experience. And we have to be really careful with that, especially if we're designing, in social impact. And at the D School, we've been trying to do some work in social justice in this country and racism in the United States. And, you can't just go in and say, how might we solve racism, right? That's just that's a lot of hubris. And so you're trying to understand as best you can. You're recognizing the impact of your presence in the situation. We have a whole curriculum around the ethics of empathy. It's not just extracting information to then monetize it. What do you owe the people that are spending time with you, that are sharing their lives, right? And how do you build that as a relationship rather than a transaction? So there's a lot in there. The definition, though, is that we're trying to understand other people in their context. And we're asking them questions in order to understand their experience. And the reason why this is important is because we want to create things that people will use, right? And rather than thrusting it on them and saying, you have to fill out this performance review, right? Like you have to do this thing, right? Which some things, especially in your all work, like we have to do, right? There are, issues and things that we have to keep up to date with on, how we treat each other in the workplace and things like that. But when we're creating something new, we're trying to figure out how meaningful it is, right? We want it to fit into people's lives in a meaningful way. And in order to understand what's meaningful, it's helpful to engage with people to understand their behavior and their beliefs. What is meaningful to you? How do we create products and services and systems that resonate intrinsically with the people who are going to use them? And how do we bring them into that process? So these are the reasons why we empathize. We're looking for needs that are not being met. We're looking for new opportunities that we haven't considered. We're challenging our own assumptions, right? Instead of just saying, well, I'm the journalist at the Washington Post, why would I ask readers what they want? If I ask them, they'll probably say, something that's not really important for them. I know what's important, right? So we're challenging our own assumptions, in some case, our own egos in that example. We're reframing the problem. We're getting inspired, right? Like when you're trying to build momentum for something new in your organization, some of that momentum can come from having real people stories to tell, right? You can say, hey, you know, Dev and I were talking, and here's what I learned about him, and here's what I think is important to him. And that will motivate people to participate in the uncertainty, right, in a way that moves beyond sort of the coldness of here's the market opportunity, or here's the data, or here are the number of people, right? Talk about the real people and have those stories to tell as a complementary way. People want to help people at the end of the day, which is kind of a nice thing about humanity. So having real stories to tell can really start to build momentum to work in new ways. Okay, take a look at this picture of this little girl. Anybody, just in the chat or out loud, what does this little girl need? What do you think she needs? What does she need? Here we go. In the chat. She needs a book. She needs a ladder. She needs lower bookshelves. She needs an iPad. Nice, Tim. She needs information. Another iPad. Thanks, Tamola. Okay, anything else? What else does she need? This is kind of a weird picture. There's like a bottle of Jameson whiskey up there. Put that in there for Katie. I'm just because Katie, you're Irish, right? That's all I meant by that. Longer arms to grow, socks, someone to help her, because Jameson is Irish. Sorry, that was a weird thing to say. A taller person, an elevator. Anything else? Someone to help her get the book, social services. Social services. Okay, good. Yeah, because of the whiskey. I got you. All right, so what if I told you that anything that is a noun, anything that's a noun, a ladder, even an iPad, right, is not a need, that's a solution. Okay, so think of needs as verbs and solutions as nouns. Okay, so here's why. So this is a little bit of a trick, this picture, right? Because you see this and you say, well, she's trying to get that book. She needs a way to reach the book. She needs a ladder. If we jump to a ladder, we go to a hardware store. There's a couple of different kinds of ladders. We pick one out, we buy one, we're done, right? But if we say what she needs is to reach, right, then a ladder is one possible avenue of solution. It could also be a lower bookshelf, as someone said, could be a revolving bookshelf, could be a robotic arm, could be a pogo stick or something to help her jump higher, right? So every time we focus on the need as a verb, it creates new avenues for possible solutions, which expands the number of possibilities, which, remember, when we generate ideas, we're trying to get as many ideas as we can, okay? So we're hardwired, most of us, to go from problem to solution. We're taught this way in school. This is how we get a good grade, right? But a lot of the things that we're taking on now don't have one solution. And even if they do have one solution at this moment, you can bet the solution is going to be different when the world changes again, which is happening all the time. Okay, so think of needs as verbs rather than nouns. Now, when we're doing this kind of need finding and empathizing, there's different categories of needs. So the cliche of the iceberg, what people say and what people do, what we can notice above the surface, these are what we call explicit needs. What people think and what they feel, what's going on below the surface, these are implicit needs. And the deeper we get into the implicit, the more we get to what's meaningful. Okay, the very simple way to remember how to do this is when we identify an explicit need, what people do, right? Then we can say, why do you do that? And usually now we're moving down below the surface. I do that because it makes me feel this. I do that because I think this is important. Why do you think this is important? Oh, because this is the way I was brought up. Oh, can you tell me more about that and how that impacts your worldview, right? So as we start to ask those questions, we get deeper into the emotional responses or the implicit, and we get closer to what's meaningful, what people think and what they feel. That's where we want to get, because we want to create systems and services and that resonate not just at an explicit level, but also with how people think and feel. If it makes them feel something, then they're more likely to participate in it. Okay, so this is why we empathize. Now, one of the ways we talk about this too is, what can we learn from observation? And by the way, when you look at this picture of the little girl, right, the most we can get from looking at a picture is explicit. We look at this and we think she needs the book, maybe she needs, shoes, like whatever it might be, right? If we want to get to the implicit, then we need to engage, we need to be there, right? we need to have a conversation with her, even if we're not physically there because of, the constraints we have in society currently, right? When we have that conversation, or if we're in the room with her, we might see that across the room are her parents sitting there on their devices. Maybe she's just precariously perched on this chair, not because she needs a book, but because she's trying to get her parents' attention. Maybe it has nothing to do with the book at all. We wouldn't know that unless we were there. Okay, so the only real way to get to the implicit and the meaningful is to actually engage with people. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second and see if there's any questions. So who do we go to for empathy? We like to talk to end users, we like to talk to stakeholders, we like to talk to experts. With design thinking, what we're focused on are what we call extreme users and analogous users. Okay, now extreme users, these are people for whom their needs are amplified. And timing is really the most important thing. We want to focus on individuals who have extreme needs in order to get to a unique solution. Not because we want to create something that's only for one person, because that wouldn't be viable, right? But because we want to get to something that's unique, and then we can test to see if it has wider resonance. I'm going to tell you an example here now. So take a look at these kitchen utensils. You might have had a peeler that looks like this one here on the left. You see this small metal peeler for a potato or carrot or apple or whatever it might be, right? I grew up with peelers like this. We had that in our house. I don't have one of those anymore, but they were around for a long time. That was kind of the normal looking sort of peeler. It's not something that you would think a lot about unless maybe you have hands that look like this. Because if you have really bad arthritis, kind of trying to hold that small metal peeler and use it can be painful. Well, it turns out this is exactly the case of the spouse of the CEO of a kitchen utensil company here in the United States. And they were on vacation and she was peeling apples to make a pie. And she was using one of those small metal peelers from their company. And it was really causing her a lot of pain because of her arthritis. And so she turned to her husband. She said, honey, we run a kitchen utensil company. Can we not create a peeler that's not so painful for me to use, right? He said, of course, dear. As soon as we get back, we'll start to prototype something. So that is actually the origin story of what is now called OXO Good Grips. So the company's called OXO. And on their website, they have a whole story about how they came to come up with this idea that a big soft rubber handle is preferable to the tiny little metal one, right? And you don't have to have arthritis to prefer kitchen utensils that have a big soft rubber handle. So this is a picture from Target here in the United States, and you can hardly buy a kitchen utensil that doesn't have a soft rubber handle, right? This is not, the orthopedic section of the, pharmacy. This is what everyone wants now. Okay, so this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to identify, in this case, a physical extreme need, but it's not always physical. And in fact, oftentimes it's more about what people think and what their values are, right? But we're trying to get to an extreme in order to get to a unique solution. And then we test to see if that unique solution has wider resonance, okay? Rather than saying, we need to create something for the middle of the market so it's a successful product, or we need to create, a system for every employee so that we can roll it out to everyone, but that nobody really wants to use because it doesn't resonate with them personally. So how do we get to something that's unique and gets us out of that sort of design by consensus mode? The way we do this is by identifying extremes and then bringing in our strategic, conversation and thought process in order to say, what extreme are we looking for? So there's types of extremes. There's demographic extremes, and this is sort of explicit and data driven. This is the group of people we're trying to reach who are this age and have been at the company for this long. And there's psychographic, and psychographic is based off of activities and interests and opinions. They're people who behave in this way, who believe these things, right? Political campaigns are really good at focusing on psychographics and demographics, right? Because in the US anyway, they focus on, where people live, because that's how our presidential system works, but also what they think and what they feel. Okay, so it's similar kind of thing, but probably for a more positive outcome. I'm going to give you a quick example, and then I'm going to leave you today with a little bit of an assignment or something to consider overnight. And the example comes from folks we've worked with a lot over the years at GE. So this gentleman here in the background, his name is Doug Dietz. And in this picture, he's at the D School. And when we do our live exec ed programs, oftentimes we do a team building activity We bring in a race car and we have the different teams compete to see who can change a tire faster. So this is Doug doing that activity. Now, Doug is a mechanical engineer, and his team at GE is in charge of designing MRI machines and other machines that are similar to MRIs. This is one of the machines, one of the versions that Doug's team designed a couple of years ago. And he was very proud of what they created because the technology that they were able to incorporate in this new model delivers more clear images than the previous model. And it's much better than their competitors' models, right? And so it's a much better machine. It's easier for doctors to read the images, and they can care for people in better ways. Doug was really proud of his machine, and hospitals really liked it and the new capabilities of it. And so they sold a lot of these. These are very expensive machines. And so GE was really happy with Doug and his teams. This was a successful product. When he was with us and he heard us talking about the user, Doug's in a B2B business, right? And he realized he'd never seen his machine in use with a patient before because he doesn't interact with patients, right? It's not part of his job. And so when he got back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he lives, he said, I want to go see my machine in use. So he knew that the local children's hospital had purchased one of his machines and that they had placed it in their cancer ward. And so he made an appointment to go and visit it. And when he got there, he was in the exam room with the technician. And the technician said, yes, we love your machine. It's great. Congratulations. But you're going to have to step out of the room because you can't be in here when a patient comes in to get their exam. And what Doug saw next changed his life, because he stepped into the hallway and he looked down at the end of the hall, and coming off the elevator was a little girl, about 8 years old, with a shaved head. And she was coming in with her dad to get an MRI, and she was terrified. And Doug could see her squirming and pulling at her dad's hand. He could hear her father say to her, it's okay, honey, we talked about this. We're just going to get it over with, and then we can go back home. But she wasn't having it. She was scared. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in one of these machines, but they're quite loud and they're claustrophobic because you lay on the table and it takes you into the thing. In fact, there's an emergency stop button on the inside for patients. If you get too scared, you can shut the machine down, right, and get out of there. And these machines aren't made smaller or quieter for children, right? They're the same machines that adults use. So the claustrophobia is even worse, right? And so Doug saw this in the hall, and before they got down to the room, he stepped back in with the technician. He said, hey, I see the patient coming. You know she's going to have to be still, right? If she's not still, the machine won't be able to get clear images, and then doctors won't be able to read them. It doesn't look like she's going to be still. Like, what are you going to do? The technician said, oh, don't worry about it. We know. We're going to do what we always do. We're going to sedate her. Anesthesiologist is on his way here now. We'll knock her out and get the pictures, and then she'll wake up later on. Now, in that moment, Doug felt like a failure as a designer, because here he had designed this machine that was technically superior, right? But that in this case, the experience of it for this patient, what we would call an extreme user, a child who has to get an MRI, they have to be unconscious in order to experience it. And so he went back home that day and he started doing some research. He called around to all the hospitals in the country that had purchased his machines in children's hospitals. And he found out that when children got their exams in his machines, they were being sedated more than 80% of the time. And Doug decided that he just couldn't live with that. So he decided to do something. He couldn't go back and start from scratch, design a completely different machine just for children. Children, not the primary, patient for this machine. Adults get MRIs much more frequently than children. Really expensive machines, didn't have the budget to do that. This is already a successful product from a business perspective. And so Doug started to think about analogous empathy. Now, analogous empathy is learning from people who design in situations other than yours and applying the insights of human behavior that they've learned back to your situation in order to create something unique. So Doug started thinking, who designs amazing experiences for children? Now, in his town, Milwaukee, they have a children's museum. And Doug used to take his boys to this children's museum, and they loved it. It's a very popular museum. And so Doug went there to talk to the curators. He said, how do you design amazing experiences for children? And they said, well, you know, kids have these fantastic imaginations. If you give a child a blanket and 4 chairs, it's not a blanket and 4 chairs anymore, right? It's a submarine or a spaceship or a cave. And if you could just tap into their imaginations, then they will complete the narrative. So Doug and his team of mechanical engineers from GE started hanging out at the Children's Museum. And they started working with kids and understanding their imaginations and learning from the curators. And just a couple of months with a small budget, they redesigned the experience of these MRI machines. They didn't change the technical aspects at all, but with some paint and some stickers, they created for kids what they call the adventure series. So this one is a jungle adventure, and you lay on the canoe and it takes you into the jungle. The stickers extend out into the hallway, and so there's like a river in the hallway. And when Doug is going there to observe and test the idea, he would see, you know, parents walking in the water and the kids jumping from rock to rock, and they're like, come on, Dad, you got to jump on the rocks, you can't just walk in the river, right? This one is the Pirate Island adventure, and in addition to the stickers and the paint, they use a pina colada aromatherapy in the exam room, so it smells like, you know, the Caribbean. And Doug said one day he was in there and talking to a mom and her daughter, and the little girl was trying to get her mom's attention, and so her mom turned to her and she said, what is it, honey? And the little girl said, can we come back tomorrow? And that's when Doug knew that they had fixed this experience. This one is a cozy camp adventure, and they use a lot of detail even beyond just the visit at the hospital. So in this one, instead of sending an appointment reminder in the mail to the parents, they send a cozy camp guide to the child. It says, get ready for your camping adventure, right? So they're creating a different expectation. They're already expecting something fun when they get to the hospital. They're not greeted by, you know, a lab tech in their blue smocks and a white coat. They're greeted by their camp counselor in, you know, cut off jeans and a flannel shirt and a straw hat. And they say, come on, we're going camping now, right? And so all those little details help the children sort of lean into the experience. So in the first year after GE launched this adventure series, the sedation rate went from higher than 80% to less than 2%. So not only did they create an experience that children didn't need to be unconscious to experience, they actually enjoyed it. So it lowered the risk and lowered the cost, right? Because they didn't have to pay for the drugs to be knocked out, and lowered the sort of noise in the system. Every time someone presses the emergency button or can't get their exam, right, then they have to get another appointment, and, you know, it can delay their care and all of those important things. And so this is a really amazing outcome just by focusing not just on the technological innovation that's possible, but also on how does this resonate with the people that we're trying to serve. And the great thing about focusing on extreme users is that it's not just the outcome that becomes the innovation, like in this case, the adventure series, it's also the insight that becomes the innovation. How do we create an experience that allows people to relax in a situation that is a complex, you know, medical appointment? And so what GE has done since is they've said, how do we do this in other experiences for children when they have to come to the hospital? How do we create stories around that? And how do we take this insight and create those types of stories and experiences for adults, right? And so taking the insight and leveraging the insight then leads to more creative outcomes, right? And so the innovation can scale. So I'm going to pause right there for just a second and see if anyone has any questions about that example, and then I'm going to tell you what the assignment is going to be for you to think about overnight. Any thoughts on that?
That was a powerful story, Justin. Thanks. It's just shows you the power of actually changing your perspective and looking at it from a different way.
Sure. Yeah. And then if you haven't cried in a while and you feel like crying, you should just search Doug Dietz online. He has a TED talk about this, and he's one of the people that comes back and coaches in our programs. So he shares his experience, and he's kind of a macho Midwestern guy, and he cries every time he tells the story. It just completely changed his life to think about, you know, the end patient, and in this case, like how his machines affect children and what can he do about it. So some of the lessons here are that when you are trying to build this creative culture, right, that even though you're not working on end products in this way, right, that we really learn by doing. Okay, so as you know, Doug started to say, What could I do differently? He's so affected by this. It's not his responsibility, right? Remember, this is already a successful product for him, right? He said, well, what can I do differently and how can I learn by doing? Let me go to the museum. Let me go talk to the curators at the museum. Let me get my team and let's start hanging out with children, right? Like he probably had to create a wedge for that to happen. You know, they're like, why are you going to the children's museum with your team? You should be back at the office working on the next version of, you know, this expensive medical device, right? But he had a compelling story to tell. I said, because let me tell you what happens when kids are in our machines, right? So who's going to say no to that, right? But he didn't know what the outcome would be. He's just stepping into that ambiguity and saying, what can I learn from this? What might I discover by taking my team and for us dipping into this unknown, right? And then how do we start to learn as we go, right? Let's try something, let's test it. He spent a lot of time in the rooms with the people while they were getting their exams, right? To get to these different adventures and figure out which adventures might resonate with children, right? And so it's very much this learn as you go. And the same is true for organizational change, right? So when we think about change in an organization, sometimes what happens is we try to take something and just implement it wholesale, right? This happened for me at the Washington Post. Like we merged the website, which was a separate company, with the newspaper, right? And we moved everybody into one building. And what happened was we lost half of our website employees in the first year. It was too big of a leap. It was like putting the snake around their shoulders, you know? And instead, you want to prototype only devoting the resources required for the next prototype, not devoting all the resources for the predetermined outcome that you think you're trying to implement. And in that way, not only are you limiting the risk and the cost, but you're also really embracing the learning as you go rather than jumping straight to the end solution. So what I tell employees when they're interested in doing something different in their organization, and they're not at the level to just be able to decide what they want to do, you know, I say, look, when you go to your supervisor and you say, hey, I see this opportunity for us as an organization and for myself. And instead of doing what you need me to do, what you hired me to do, what I already do well, I want to stop doing that and do this other thing, right? Can you create an opportunity for me to do this other thing? When people do that, they're putting all of the risk onto the supervisor, right? Who has to replace the person that they're moving and it's not even their idea, right? So instead you say, how could I have one day a month? Could I have one day a month to pursue this other thing that's my idea? And at the end of 6 months, I'm going to show you what I did with those 6 days. And in those 6 days, I'm either going to prove or disprove that I should now get one day a week, right? And after that one day a week for a certain amount of time, I'm going to show you what I learned and did from that. And I'm going to prove or disprove that I should get 2 days a week. And eventually, if the idea or the effort shows merit, yes, there's a shift that happens maybe full time. It's the same as prototyping a product. Here's an idea we have. What do you think of this? Right? And it proves or disproves whether or not you should get to the next one. But the only way you learn that is by doing, right? The only way Akshay got to the design of his company was by going to the coffee shop with his cardboard, right? And so the creative confidence that that requires, right, is clear, I think, because you're trying something different, not knowing what the outcome is going to be, but in the doing, you create the evidence that either says you should continue or you should stop and preserve those resources for other ideas that show promise. Okay, so that's tip number 2 on creative culture is how do we learn by doing? Instead of deciding before we even try, let's see what we might learn by trying something small. It doesn't cost a lot of resources. This is the second part of Doug's example that I want you to take with you overnight. And that is the way we sort of prioritize who we're going to go engage with. So before we talked about, you know, what is the behavior you're trying to encourage and whose behavior? And that's great because it tells you what your initial, you know, impulse is about who you want to engage with, who this might be important with. But in order to take kind of a more comprehensive approach, this is a tool I developed called an empathy plan. So you look at the thing you're working on, you say, who are the ecosystem of people affected by this, right? And then which group do we want to prioritize? And remember, prioritize just means first. Okay, so we talked about this before. Rather than trying to affect everybody equally all at once, which is nearly impossible, it's where do we want to start and how do we break it down? Now, who's an extreme user within this group and how are we defining that extreme? Is it by demographic? Is it by psychographic? And why, right? So this is a strategic conversation in your multidisciplinary team. Who do we want to prioritize? What represents an extreme? What is the behavior or action that is important to us, do we think, you know, for this effort? And then what do we hope to learn? So in an organizational context, you might define extreme by, the employees who've been around the longest, or the ones who are brand new, or the ones who've recently switched jobs, or the ones who oversee the most direct reports, right? So there's lots of different ways to think about those extremes, or the ones who filed the most complaints, right? That would be a behavioral approach rather than a demographic one, right? So lots of different ways to think about that. So here's the example from Doug, right? Who is the ecosystem of people affected by the MRI machines? There's the doctors, there are the who read the X-ray, the outcome. There are the technicians who run it in the exam. There are the patients. There's a hospital procurement, the people who actually purchase the machines. There then a whole bunch of internal users. There's his team, the GE engineers, the supply chain, like all of that kind of stuff, right? So there's lots of different groups. So now we're just kind of periscoping down, right? Decide which group to prioritize, not periscope, telescoping. Patients, right? Within the patient group, let's get even more narrow. Extreme user, a child who needs an MRI, that's an unusual medical need, right? And now you know where to begin, okay? So this is what I want you to consider in this project that you shared with someone in a breakout room earlier. And we're gonna do this overnight, okay? I never know where we're gonna end up when we get started in the day. So that's why it's great to have multiple sessions. So this is where we'll pick back up. But I want you to think about, what is an empathy plan? Okay, so you've thought about whose behavior you're trying to encourage, but now take a step back and say, who are all the different groups of people affected by this, right? And which group would I prioritize? What's an extreme user, and how am I thinking about extreme? And how does that relate to our strategy for the rollout of this thing that we're working on? And then what do we hope to learn? What are the first couple of questions we're going to ask, knowing that subsequent questions are going to come from those answers, okay? Once you have this, you can begin this design thinking way of working. All right, I'm going to pause there again, come back to you all. Questions about that? I'll put it back up there in just a second so that you can take a picture of it so you can think about it overnight. And then let's take a couple minutes to debrief. So we have about 6 minutes left. We've covered a lot today. Thank you for your patience and your participation. Okay, questions or thoughts? How do I choose to prioritize? Yeah, so there's different strategies, right? So it depends on, are you focused on an extreme user within the highest number of employees in your organization, right? Like if this is an internal training system that you're going to roll out,
yep.
If it's product managers, right? Now, how do I get to an extreme user within a product manager? Maybe it's a product manager who's managing the most products. Maybe it's the product managers who are working on the most long-term single project products, but it's a long-term, right? So it depends. It depends on what your intent is. And again, like working in a team, part of these tools, it gives you a way to engage in that conversation that you might just skip past otherwise. What is our intent? What do we think is important to learn as we get into this? But there's no one answer for who you should prioritize.
But the idea of the extreme view is to kind of take what's the extreme experience, so that you're kind of really looking at it from their perspective.
Yes, and remember,
out of your kind of solution mode and into kind of their experience in a different way.
well, and it forces you to be specific, right? And because again, it's at the beginning of a project where we're more vulnerable to being non-specific, because we're like, oh, we want to create someone for everyone in this category, right? Because that's kind of how we think about success, is number of people who adopt it or whatever. And so we want to be specific at the outset in order to avoid the problem of creating something that is mediocre, because we're trying to create something that has something for everyone, but that in totality, nobody wants to use. Sometimes I show a picture of, like one of those Swiss Army knives that has like 100 different tools coming out of it, right? It's no longer a knife. It's not a pocket knife. You can't carry it in your pocket anymore, right? Because someone said they wanted a corkscrew, and someone else said they wanted a toothpick, and someone else said they wanted, and so everything's in there. But nobody wants that knife, even if it has the one thing that they wanted, unless they just want to put it on their desk and look at it or something, because you can't carry it around anymore. right? So that's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid. And early stage, the more specific we can get, the more specific the feedback we get when we start to test, right? Because we're not testing everything, we're testing this aspect, right? And so then we get specific feedback, and then that's more actionable for us as we move through the sort of, learn as we go experiential learning process. Recommended articles. Yes, I will share some of those. I have several. Okay, good. Any other questions? Oh yeah, soccer match. I've been following.
I was just going to say, Justin, you might notice a sudden drop off in attendance from the English or German-based attendees, because
yes.
In fact I can hear the UK national anthem, which happens to be used by the England team. Speaking as a Scotswoman, that does rather annoy me. But anyway, just wanted to say thank you very much for what has been an extremely engaging session. Lots of lovely feedback in the chat, which is always good to see. And I think for me, there's a real challenge around thinking about how we manage change. And I think in HR sometimes we're guilty of big programs and big sort of top-down activities, and really focusing on prioritizing, empathizing with our employees, and really changing our perspective is a huge opportunity for us in the HR function. So thank you very much for this afternoon, for getting up early in Stanford, and we will kick off again tomorrow at the same time, same place, and look forward to seeing everyone again then. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.